My name is Chloe. I am 31 years old and a self-made real estate broker right here in Atlanta. At my mother-in-law Valerie's house for our traditional Sunday dinner, I caught my husband Julian's reflection in the sliding patio glass. He was emptying a small, unmarked packet of white powder directly into my bowl of seafood gumbo. My stomach violently dropped. Everything in me screamed to run to flip the heavy dining table to demand answers. But I stayed completely silent. I did not shed a single tear. Instead, when he turned his back to watch the football game, I smiled at his mother and swapped our bowls. Exactly 5 minutes later, she was foaming at the mouth and fighting for her life on her expensive hardwood floor. Before I tell you how I brought in federal agents and sent my own husband to a concrete cell, let me know what city you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you have ever had to play chess with toxic family members who thought they were playing checkers. Growing up, I was taught that family is everything. But as a Black woman navigating the corporate world and building my own commercial real estate brokerage from the ground up, I learned the hard way that the blood in your veins does not guarantee loyalty. It only guarantees access, and my husband's family loved having access to my bank accounts. Julian is 34, a director of a local nonprofit charity, a man who built his entire reputation on being a pillar of the community and a devoted, God-fearing husband. We had been married for 4 years. From the outside looking at our social media photos, we were the ultimate power couple. But the reality behind closed doors was that I paid the mortgage on the sprawling suburban house we lived in. I paid off his private university student loans. I even paid for the expensive organic groceries that his mother Valerie used to cook her famous Sunday dinners every single week. Valerie is 58 years old. She sits in the front pew of the church every Sunday wearing extravagant designer hats that I indirectly financed. She has never liked me. To her, I was always too ambitious, too loud, too independent. I did not fit the mold of the submissive, quiet wife she wanted for her golden child. And then there is Jasmine, Julian's 29-year-old sister, and her husband Darnell. They are the kind of people who always have a new business idea, but never have any capital to start it. Darnell calls himself a cryptocurrency investor and a financial visionary. I call him unemployed and deeply in debt. This particular Sunday evening felt suffocating. The house smelled heavily of spices, simmering seafood, and Valerie's overpowering, expensive perfume. The chandelier above the dining table cast a warm, deceptive glow over the crystal glasses and the fine china. It looked like a picture-perfect magazine cover of a successful African-American family, but the atmosphere was completely toxic. Jasmine and Darnell were lounging on the custom leather sofa in the living room, arguing loudly about the Atlanta Falcons game playing on the massive flat-screen television. I had stepped away to the guest bathroom to wash my hands. I was mentally and physically exhausted. I had just closed a massive commercial property deal on Friday, and all I wanted to do was eat, quickly go home, and sleep in my own bed. As I walked back down the long, dimly lit hallway toward the dining room, I stopped dead in my tracks. The dining room opens up to a large sunroom with sliding glass doors. It was pitch dark outside, turning those large glass doors into a perfect, flawless mirror. Through the clear reflection, I saw Julian standing alone at the dining table. He was hovering over my designated seat. In his right hand was a tiny piece of folded wax paper. With terrifying calmness, he tapped the paper, letting a fine white powder fall directly into my steaming bowl of gumbo. He took a heavy silver spoon, quickly stirred the thick, dark stew until the powder completely dissolved into the broth, and then shoved the empty paper deep into his pants pocket. My breath caught sharply in my throat. I pressed my back against the cold hallway wall, completely out of sight, pressing my hand hard over my mouth to muffle my own gasp. My mind raced at 1,000,000 miles an hour. What was that powder? Was it drugs? Was it poison? Why would the man who kissed my forehead this morning, the man who held my hand and prayed over our meals, put something foreign in my food? I felt a cold sweat break out across my neck and chest. A weaker woman would have confronted him right there. A naive woman would have walked into that dining room, crying, begging him to explain why he was doing this. But I am not weak, and I am certainly not naive. In my line of work, when you realize you are sitting at a table with predators, you do not show them your cards. You let them think they have won right up until you flip the board and destroy their entire game. I took 3 slow, deep breaths, smoothing down my dress and fixing my posture in the hallway mirror. I painted a bright, relaxed smile on my face and walked into the dining room. Julian looked up at me, his expression completely blank, wearing a perfectly practiced mask of domestic bliss. "Hey, baby," he said smoothly, pulling my heavy oak chair out for me. "Dinner is ready. Mom just served the gumbo." "Thank you, sweetheart," I replied, keeping my voice incredibly steady and light. I sat down and stared at the dark, rich stew sitting directly in front of me. To the naked eye, it looked completely normal. Slices of spicy sausage jumbo shrimp and thick crab legs swam in the dark brown roux. But I knew death was hiding inside that bowl. From the living room, Darnell yelled something obnoxious about a horrible pass on the football field. Julian instantly turned his head, stepping away from the dining table to jog into the living room and yell at the television screen with his brother-in-law. Jasmine was still sprawled on the couch, entirely glued to her phone screen, ignoring everything around her. At the head of the long table sat Valerie. She had just pulled her chair in and was adjusting her pristine white silk napkin on her lap. She looked at my bowl and I noticed her dark eyes lingering on the broth for just a fraction of a second too long. That is when the horrible truth hit me. She knew. She was the one who cooked the food in the kitchen, and she was the one who portioned the bowls out before bringing them to the table. The realization that my own mother-in-law might be completely complicit in whatever Julian was plotting hit me like a runaway freight train. But I did not have time to process the emotional devastation or the heartbreak. Survival was the only thing on my mind right now. I looked down at my bowl, then looked over at Valerie's bowl at the head of the table. I put on my best innocent, deferential voice. "You know, Valerie," I said loudly enough for her to hear, but quiet enough not to draw any attention from the men in the living room. "It looks like Julian gave me the bowl with all the premium crab meat. You cooked all day long, you absolutely deserve the best portion. Here, let me trade with you." Before she could even register what I was doing or offer a protest, I stood up quickly. I picked up my poisoned bowl and placed it directly in front of her placemat. At the exact same time, I grabbed her untouched safe bowl and pulled it over to my side of the table. Valerie frowned deeply, her immense pride warring with whatever dark knowledge she was hiding. She opened her mouth to argue, but she is a woman ruled entirely by greed and a desperate, pathetic need to be treated like royalty by everyone around her. Looking down at the extra crab legs resting in the bowl I had just handed her, her arrogance won the battle. "Well, you are right about that, Chloe," Valerie said with a smug, condescending little smirk. "I did slave over that hot stove since 6 o'clock this morning. It is only fair the matriarch of this family gets the finest cuts of meat." She picked up her heavy silver spoon. I sat back down in my chair, folding my hands neatly in my lap. I watched her closely. Julian walked back into the dining room, shaking his head at the football score and muttering under his breath. He sat down next to me, picking up his own spoon. He glanced at me out of the corner of his eye, waiting anxiously for me to take my first bite. I picked up my spoon, dipped it into the safe gumbo I had taken from Valerie, and brought it to my lips. I blew on it gently and took a large bite, making a deliberate show of chewing and enjoying the flavor. "This is absolutely delicious, Valerie," I lied smoothly, looking directly into my husband's eyes. I watched Julian let out a tiny, almost imperceptible sigh of relief. His shoulders dropped. He truly thought his job was done. Valerie, meanwhile, had eagerly taken 3 large spoonfuls of the poisoned bowl. She was chewing happily, entirely unaware that her precious son's deadly unspoken cocktail was currently coating her throat and entering her bloodstream. I kept eating slowly, my eyes darting subtly between Julian and his mother. 1 minute passed, then 2 minutes. Jasmine finally dragged herself to the table, complaining loudly about being starving. Darnell followed right behind her, pulling out a chair and immediately digging into the warm bread basket without bothering to wash his hands. The conversation around the table was incredibly mundane. Jasmine complaining about her expensive acrylic nails chipping. Darnell bragging loudly about a new crypto coin that was supposedly going to make him a millionaire before December. Julian nodding along politely, playing the supportive brother-in-law to perfection. And then, exactly 5 minutes after we sat down, it happened. Valerie suddenly dropped her silver spoon. It clattered loudly against the expensive porcelain bowl, spilling broth onto the table. She brought both of her hands up to her throat, her eyes widening in sheer absolute panic. Her heavy dining chair scraped violently against the hardwood floor as she pushed herself back from the table. Mom Jasmine asked, annoyance lacing her voice because her story had been interrupted. "What is wrong with you?" Valerie could not answer her. A harsh, wet wheezing sound tore from her throat. Her face began to turn a terrifying deep shade of purple. Her silk blouse was rapidly soaking with sweat, and the veins in her neck bulged against her skin like thick ropes. She stood up abruptly, her hands clutching frantically at her own neck, knocking her crystal water glass over in the process. The ice water spilled entirely across the table, soaking rapidly into the white linen tablecloth. "Mom!" Julian yelled, jumping out of his chair so fast it tipped backward. He rushed around the table to get to her. Suddenly, thick white foam began bubbling from the corners of Valerie's mouth. Her eyes rolled completely back into her head, showing only the whites, and her knees buckled beneath her weight. She collapsed entirely, hitting the hardwood floor with a heavy, sickening thud. Her body began to convulse violently, her heels drumming rapidly against the wood as her arms flailed uncontrollably. Jasmine started screaming at the absolute top of her lungs, a piercing sound that echoed through the entire house. Darnell jumped back against the wall, overturning his chair, yelling frantically for someone to find a phone and call 911 immediately. The entire dining room erupted into absolute terrifying chaos. But I did not scream. I did not move to help. I sat perfectly still in my chair, looking down at my safe, untouched bowl of gumbo. Then I slowly turned my head to look directly at my husband. Julian was on his knees right next to his mother, his hands hovering over her violently convulsing body, completely paralyzed by fear and shock. But he was not just looking at his dying mother. Slowly, as the horrific reality of the situation crashed down on his brain, his head snapped up. His terrified, wide eyes locked instantly onto mine across the room. Then his gaze shifted frantically from my calm face down to the bowl of gumbo I was eating from. The bowl with the extra crab legs. The exact bowl he had laced with the white powder just moments ago. He knew exactly what had just happened. In that split second, amidst the hysterical screaming and the absolute chaos of the dining room, my husband realized he had just poisoned his own mother. And I stared right back at him, my face a mask of cold, unbothered stone. The silence between Julian and me in that moment was louder than Jasmine's panicked sobbing. I did not reach out to comfort him. I did not dial for an ambulance. I simply watched the terror completely devour his soul, letting him know without a single word that the game had just begun and I was going to destroy him. The wail of the ambulance sirens tore through the quiet suburban neighborhood, shattering the illusion of our perfect Sunday evening. I rode in the front seat of the heavy emergency vehicle, my hands folded tightly in my lap, staring blankly at the dark road ahead. In the back, paramedics worked frantically on Valerie. Julian had insisted on riding in the back with her, his face pale and slick with cold sweat. He kept screaming at the medics to do something, anything, his voice cracking in a panic that I knew was only half about his dying mother. Jasmine and Darnell were following right behind us in Darnell's leased black BMW, aggressively tailgating the ambulance, likely speeding and running red lights to keep up with the flashing sirens. When we finally arrived at Atlanta Medical Center, the emergency bay doors blew open. A coordinated team of doctors and nurses swarmed the stretcher the second it hit the pavement, shouting medical jargon I barely registered. Anaphylaxis, airway severely compromised, epinephrine administered, no response. They rushed her through the heavy double doors into the intensive care unit, leaving us standing in the stark, aggressively bright fluorescent lighting of the hospital waiting room. The smell of bleach and stale coffee hung heavy in the air. Julian collapsed into one of the cheap, stiff vinyl chairs, burying his face in his large hands. He was trembling violently. To any casual outsider, he looked like a completely devastated son, terrified of losing his beloved mother. But I knew better. I took a deep, steadying breath, forcing hot tears to well up in my eyes. I let my shoulders shake, transforming instantly into the frantic, grieving daughter-in-law. I rushed over and knelt beside his chair, placing a trembling hand on his knee. "Julian!" I sobbed, pitching my voice to sound completely broken and helpless. "Is she going to make it? What did the doctors say in the back of the ambulance?" He flinched at my touch like I had physically burned him. He snapped his head up, his eyes bloodshot and wild, darting frantically around the waiting room before locking aggressively onto my face. Before Julian could even attempt to answer me, the automatic glass doors slid open, and Jasmine stormed into the waiting room with Darnell trailing closely behind her. Her high heels clicked aggressively against the cheap linoleum floor. She was still wearing her Sunday church dress, but the facade of grace was entirely gone. She did not even look at her brother. She marched straight toward me, her long acrylic index finger pointed directly at my face. "What did you do to my mother?" Jasmine screamed. Her sharp voice echoed off the waiting room walls, drawing the immediate attention of every nurse, security guard, and patient in the vicinity. I stood up slowly, keeping the fake tears flowing freely down my cheeks. "Jasmine, please," I whispered, stepping back defensively and holding my hands up. "I do not know what happened. She just started choking at the table." "Do not play dumb with me, Chloe!" Jasmine yelled, taking another aggressive step forward so she was entirely invading my personal space. "You never liked her. You have been insanely jealous of her from the exact moment you married my brother. You hated that she was the respected matriarch of this family, and you were just some outsider trying to buy your way in with your real estate money." Julian stood up abruptly from the vinyl chair. He did not tell his sister to calm down. He did not step between us to defend his wife. Instead, he eagerly joined the attack, desperate to shift the narrative before anyone started asking real dangerous questions. "Jasmine is absolutely right," Julian said, his voice loud, booming, and completely accusatory. He looked at me with a fabricated expression of deep disgust. "You bought the groceries yesterday, Chloe. Where did you get that seafood? Did you go to some cheap discount market on the bad side of town to save a few dollars? Did you leave it sitting out in your hot car while you were doing business deals?" I stared at him, letting my mouth fall open in a perfectly executed portrait of absolute shock and marital betrayal. "Julian, I bought the seafood at the premium organic market, just like I always do. The exact same upscale market you specifically told me to go to. I spent $300 on that crab meat alone. I followed her recipe perfectly." "Do not lie to us!" Jasmine shrieked, clapping her hands together with every single word to emphasize her fake theatrical outrage. "You probably poisoned the food on purpose. You probably left it out to rot because you wanted to ruin Sunday dinner. You have always been a bitter, nasty woman disguised in expensive tailored suits. You wanted to hurt my mother because you are jealous of our tight family bond." They were loud, talking me in front of a dozen strangers, weaponizing the offensive stereotype of the angry, jealous woman to build an instant alibi right there in the hospital waiting room. Darnell stood right behind them, nodding his head in firm agreement, adding his own unhelpful, pathetic comments about how I always thought I was better than everyone else just because I owned a successful commercial business. They were quickly building a unified front, painting me as the careless, spiteful daughter-in-law who accidentally or intentionally fed their sweet mother tainted food. I lowered my head, bringing my trembling hands up to my face to completely hide my expression as my shoulders heaved with fake dramatic sobs. I let them yell. I let them scream their ridiculous, unfounded accusations at the top of their lungs. Behind my hands, my eyes were bone dry. My mind was a steel trap running cold calculations, analyzing every single micro-expression on Julian's handsome face. I watched the way a thick muscle twitched rapidly in his jaw. I noticed the excessive sweat pooling at his temples despite the freezing aggressive air conditioning in the hospital waiting area. I saw the way his eyes constantly darted toward the heavy double doors of the emergency room, not with hope, but with sheer unadulterated terror. He was not just scared that his mother was going to die. He was absolutely terrified that she was going to live. Because if Valerie woke up, the authorities would immediately ask her exactly what she ate. The doctors would draw blood, and run extensive toxicology reports. They would isolate the specific chemical compound of whatever white powder he dumped into my bowl. He was wildly overcompensating, shouting at me about cheap seafood to aggressively establish a plausible excuse for severe food poisoning or an extreme allergic reaction. He desperately needed a scapegoat, and he needed it fast. The dark realization settled deep into my bones like solid ice. The man I slept next to every single night, the man who stood at the altar and promised before God to protect me, had looked me dead in the eyes and handed me a bowl of absolute death. And now, he was actively trying to frame me for his own catastrophic murderous mistake. I felt a sudden sharp twist in my lower stomach, a harsh physical reminder of my own vulnerability in this situation. I knew I had to play this perfectly. In real estate, you never reveal your leverage until the contract is ready to be signed. If I confronted him right now, he would fiercely deny it. He would use his sister's loud hysteria and Darnell's intimidating physical presence to force me into silence. He would confidently claim I was crazy, that the severe stress of the horrific situation was making me paranoid and delusional. I needed undeniable concrete proof. I needed to let him enthusiastically dig his own grave so exceptionally deep that he could never possibly climb out. I slowly lowered my hands, looking up at Julian and Jasmine with red, puffy, pathetic eyes. "I am so sorry," I whispered, my voice breaking flawlessly on cue. "I swear to you, I did not do anything bad to the food. I just bought exactly what was on the grocery list. I love Valerie. I would never ever hurt her." Jasmine scoffed loudly, rolling her eyes dramatically and turning her back on me in pure disgust. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, muttering loudly under her breath about how I was a cold-hearted snake who systematically destroyed everything I touched. Julian stared at me for a long, heavy, terrifying moment. He was intensely searching my face, desperately looking for any minute sign that I knew exactly what he had done in that dining room. He was rapidly trying to figure out exactly why I swapped the bowls at the dining table. Did I see him hovering over my seat in the reflection of the glass? Was it just a random, incredibly lucky coincidence based on my desire for more crab legs? I gave him absolutely nothing but a look of complete, shattered devastation. I let my lower lip tremble visibly. I wrapped my arms around my own torso, making myself look incredibly small, fragile, and utterly defeated. The intense tension in Julian's broad shoulders loosened just a fraction of an inch. He bought it. He actually believed I was completely oblivious to his dark, murderous intent. He reached out and grabbed my upper arms, his grip bruising and entirely too tight under the false guise of an emotional embrace. "We will figure this out, Chloe," Julian said, his voice dropping an octave to sound incredibly strong, authoritative, and deeply concerned. "But if the doctors come out here and say this was food poisoning from your cheap ingredients, you and I are going to have a very serious conversation about your unbelievable carelessness regarding my family." I nodded meekly, staring blankly at his expensive silk tie, the one I had bought him for his birthday. "Yes, Julian," I replied softly, perfectly, playing the submissive role he so desperately wanted in a wife. "Anything you say. I just want her to be okay." Just then, a tall, serious nurse, wearing dark blue scrubs, emerged from the heavy emergency room doors. She looked directly at our tense group, her expression completely grim, exhausted, and unreadable. "Family of Valerie Davis," she called out softly, holding a silver medical clipboard in her hands. Julian let go of my arms instantly and sprinted toward her. Jasmine and Darnell were right on his heels, pushing aggressively past the waiting room chairs. I took one final deep breath, mentally adjusting my invisible armor, and followed my treacherous, murderous family to hear the official verdict. Every single step I took felt like walking through deep, freezing water, but my resolve was absolute. I was not just going to survive this nightmare. I was going to systematically dismantle their entire lives piece by bloody piece until there was absolutely nothing left of them. I excused myself from the suffocating tension of the waiting room, claiming I desperately needed a strong cup of black coffee to steady my severely frayed nerves. Julian did not even look up from his phone when I walked away. Jasmine just rolled her eyes, muttering something about how selfish I was for thinking about my own thirst while her mother was fighting for her life. I ignored her completely. I kept my head down, wrapping my cardigan tightly around my shoulders as I navigated the cold, sterile hospital corridors. The cafeteria was located on the lower level, requiring me to walk past the main bank of elevators and the emergency exit stairwells. My mind was spinning with the terrifying reality of what I had just survived. I needed a moment of absolute silence to process the horrific fact that my husband had deliberately poisoned my food. As I approached the heavy metal door of stairwell B, I heard a sudden sharp scuffle. Someone was being shoved aggressively against the wall. The heavy door was propped open just a fraction of an inch by a discarded medical glove. I froze instantly. The aggressive, hushed voices leaking through that tiny crack belonged entirely to the two men I had just left in the waiting area. It was Darnell and Julian. I pressed my back completely flat against the cold concrete wall right next to the stairwell door. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs, but my hands were completely steady. I slowly raised my left wrist. With a simple tap on my Apple Watch screen, I activated the voice memo recording app. A tiny red dot appeared, signaling that it was capturing every single sound. I held my breath, closing my eyes to focus entirely on the audio. "What the hell did you actually give her?" Darnell hissed violently. His voice was frantic, lacking all of the arrogant bravado he usually displayed at family dinners. "Keep your damn voice down!" Julian snapped back, his tone sharp and laced with absolute panic. "I gave her exactly what we discussed. Just one single packet. One packet of what Darnell demanded, his voice cracking with sheer terror. You told me you had this completely handled. You told me that stuff was just supposed to induce a natural miscarriage. Why the hell is your mother in anaphylactic shock? Why is she dying on a ventilator right now?" The words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Miscarriage. My vision actually blurred for a second. The floor beneath my feet felt like it was violently tilting. A miscarriage. I gripped the cold metal frame of the door to keep myself from collapsing onto the linoleum floor. Why would Julian be talking about a miscarriage? "I do not know what happened," Julian whispered frantically, his voice trembling with a cowardice I had never heard before. The guy I bought it from swore it was just a high dose of the abortion pill. He said it would just look like a heavy cycle. He said she would cramp up, bleed, and the problem would be completely solved by Monday morning. It was not supposed to cause a severe allergic reaction. "You bought black market pills from a street dealer to slip into your wife's food." Darnell accused, his breathing heavy and erratic. "Are you completely out of your mind? If the cops test that food, they are going to find unregulated chemicals. They are going to trace it back to you. And if they look into your finances and see that massive hole in your charity account, they are going to lock both of us up in federal prison. I am not going down for attempted murder just because you wanted to play pharmacist to get out of being a father." "Shut up, Darnell," Julian commanded desperately. "Just shut up and follow my lead." Chloe ate the safe bowl. My mom got the wrong one because Chloe is a manipulative witch who always has to have the best portion. We just have to stick to the story. It was bad seafood. Chloe bought cheap ingredients. We repeat that until the police believe it. Now get back to the waiting room before she notices we are gone. I heard their heavy footsteps moving toward the heavy metal door. I immediately stopped the recording on my watch, turning on my heel and walking briskly down the hallway toward the cafeteria. I forced my legs to move normally, even though my entire body was numb with shock. I bought a black coffee I had absolutely no intention of drinking. I stood by the condiment station for a full 5 minutes, staring blankly at the wall, trying to process the magnitude of the pure evil I had just uncovered. Julian was not just trying to poison me, he was trying to murder an unborn child. But how did he even know? I did not know I was pregnant. I had been feeling unusually fatigued over the last couple of weeks, but I attributed that entirely to the stress of closing my latest commercial real estate deal. I had gone to my private physician for my annual physical and routine blood work last week, but the clinic had not called me with any results yet. I walked slowly back to the waiting room, gripping the hot paper cup so tightly my knuckles turned completely white. When I arrived, Julian and Darnell were already sitting down looking at their phones with fake expressions of worried boredom. Jasmine was pacing the floor. As soon as I took my seat, a doctor in a long white coat pushed through the swinging double doors. His expression was incredibly grave. He bypassed Julian completely and walked directly over to me. "Are you Chloe, the daughter-in-law?" the doctor asked quietly, his clipboard held tightly against his chest. "Yes, that is me," I replied, standing up immediately. Julian rushed over, putting a possessive, heavy arm around my waist to assert his dominance as the husband. "I am her son," Julian said loudly, making sure the entire waiting room heard him. "Tell me exactly what is happening with my mother." The doctor looked at Julian, then looked back at me with a very strange, intensely protective expression. "Valerie is currently stable, but her condition is extremely critical," the doctor explained carefully. "We had to pump her stomach and administer several rounds of heavy counteracting agents. However, I need to speak with Chloe privately for a moment regarding the toxicology report and some standard admission questions." Julian tightened his grip on my waist, his fingers digging painfully into my side. "Anything you need to say to my wife, you can say right here in front of me," Julian demanded, his voice carrying a dangerous defensive edge. "We do not keep secrets in this family." The doctor did not flinch. "Actually, hospital protocol dictates that I speak with her alone in this specific instance," he stated firmly, gesturing toward a small private consultation room down the hall. "Please follow me, Chloe." I gently but firmly peeled Julian's fingers off my waist. "I will be right back, sweetheart," I said softly, giving him a deeply reassuring look that completely masked the burning hatred screaming through my veins. He looked terrified, but he could not argue further without causing a highly suspicious scene. I followed the doctor into the small consultation room. He closed the heavy wooden door behind us, ensuring absolute privacy. He gestured for me to sit down in one of the padded chairs, but I remained standing. I needed to feel grounded. I needed to be ready for whatever blow was coming next. "Chloe, I am going to be entirely direct with you," the doctor began, his tone dropping to a serious, confidential whisper. "When we pumped your mother-in-law's stomach, we ran an immediate toxicology screen. She did not have an allergic reaction to seafood. She ingested a massive lethal dose of misoprostol mixed with a highly toxic unidentified chemical filler. Because Valerie has a pre-existing heart condition, the massive dose of unrefined chemicals sent her body into immediate anaphylactic shock. But that is not the only reason I pulled you in here, Chloe. When we pulled up your medical file, the system flagged an urgent alert from your primary care physician. Your clinic uploaded your routine blood work results just 2 days ago. They noted that they tried to call your home phone several times to deliver the critical news, but your husband kept intercepting the calls. Chloe, your blood work indicates that you are exactly 8 weeks pregnant." Julian knew. He was trying to brutally murder our innocent unborn baby. The sterile walls of the consultation room seemed to close in on me entirely. I placed my trembling hands flat against my stomach, trying to physically shield the tiny life growing inside me. I looked at the doctor, my face an expressionless mask of pure, unadulterated vengeance. I thanked the doctor, my voice eerily calm despite the nuclear explosion that had just decimated my entire reality. I walked out of that small consultation room a completely different woman than the one who had walked in. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind me, sealing away the naive, loving wife who believed her husband was just a flawed but decent man. Every single step I took down the stark white hospital hallway was a masterclass in severe emotional suppression. I could actually feel the tiny, fragile life growing inside me, a silent, unseen passenger in a body that had just been deliberately targeted for execution. Julian wanted me to bleed out on his mother's expensive hardwood floor. He wanted to flush his own unborn child away, just to solve whatever dark hidden crisis he had created for himself. The sheer magnitude of his betrayal was suffocating, but I refused to let it break me. I pushed open the swinging double doors leading back into the main waiting area, instantly shifting my facial expressions to match the role I needed to play. As the waiting room came into view, I saw Julian pacing frantically near a row of vending machines. Jasmine was sitting in a vinyl chair with her arms crossed tightly over her chest, aggressively glaring at a daytime television show she was not actually watching. Darnell was chewing his fingernails down to the quick, his anxious eyes darting toward the exit every time the automatic glass doors slid open. I forced my facial muscles to soften completely. I made my eyes wide, desperate, and incredibly vulnerable. I let a fresh, convincing wave of fabricated tears pool in my eyes. Julian turned his head and saw me walking toward him. He rushed forward immediately, wrapping his thick arms tightly around my shoulders and pulling me aggressively against his chest. I buried my face deep into his shirt, inhaling the scent of his expensive cologne, mixed heavily with the sour, unmistakable stench of his own panicked sweat. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to claw his eyes out. My hands wanted to reach up and wrap around his throat, but instead, I wrapped my arms around his waist and squeezed him back with equal desperation. "I love you so much," I whispered softly into his chest, my voice shaking with a manufactured terror that he completely bought without question. "The doctor said she is going to pull through, Julian. She is strong." I felt his entire body go completely rigid against mine. It was just a microsecond of stiffness, a tiny involuntary muscular reaction, but my heightened senses caught it immediately. He was intensely disappointed. His mother surviving meant he still had a massive, unpredictable liability on his hands. "Thank God," Julian replied, his voice thick with a fake, theatrical emotion that made my stomach churn. "I do not know what I would do without my family." I pulled back from the hug, wiping my eyes delicately with the back of my hand. "I need to go to the restroom and splash some cold water on my face," I told him, keeping my head bowed in a show of pure, overwhelming exhaustion. "I will be right back, sweetheart." He nodded quickly, already turning his nervous attention back to his anxious brother-in-law. I walked briskly into the women's restroom and quickly locked the heavy metal door of the furthest handicap stall behind me. I dropped the grieving, terrified wife act the exact second the metal latch clicked into place. I leaned heavily over the porcelain toilet, my stomach violently rejecting the black coffee I had forced down in the cafeteria earlier. My body was physically reacting to the pure evil I was currently trapped in. After wiping my mouth with scratchy brown paper towels, I stood up straight and pulled out my cell phone. I completely bypassed my normal contacts list and manually dialed a secure, unlisted phone number I had memorized several years ago. The phone rang exactly twice before a deep, gravelly voice answered the line. "Desmond," I said, my voice dropping to a sharp, completely authoritative whisper. Desmond was a former Atlanta police precinct captain who now ran a highly exclusive, high-end private security and investigation firm. I kept his specialized services on a very lucrative monthly retainer to vet massive commercial real estate deals and handle deep background checks for my elite corporate clients. He was utterly ruthless, intensely discreet, and he owed me a massive personal favor for catching a severe legal discrepancy that saved his own business from a devastating federal audit 3 years ago. Chloe Desmond replied instantly, immediately recognizing the serious edge in my tone. "What is the emergency tonight?" "I need a complete digital and financial dissection on 2 targets immediately," I instructed coldly, staring fiercely at the metal door of the bathroom stall. "My husband Julian and his brother-in-law Darnell. I want every single text message, every deleted email, and every hidden encrypted messaging application on their cell phones. I want you to meticulously trace every single penny moving through Julian's nonprofit charity operating accounts. Find out exactly where Darnell has been throwing his money in the cryptocurrency market. And Desmond, I need you to look deeply for any recent massive expenditures, secret debts to unsavory people, or sudden life insurance policy changes. I need everything you can legally or illegally find within the next 48 hours. Money is absolutely no object for this job. Consider it completely done," Desmond said, without a single moment of hesitation or unnecessary questioning. "Are you in any immediate physical danger right now? Do I need to send a security team to your location?" "Not anymore," I replied, stepping out of the stall and staring at my cold, dead reflection in the large mirror above the sinks. "But they are." I will text you their full legal names and social security numbers from my secure encrypted server right now. Do not contact me on this personal cell phone again unless it is a matter of absolute life or death. Send all the preliminary investigative files to the ghost email account we set up for the downtown commercial project last year. I ended the call immediately. I walked over to the stainless steel sinks, turned the faucet on high, and splashed freezing cold water directly onto my face. I watched the cold water drip down my chin and splash onto my designer blouse. I took a long, deep breath, feeling the cold air fill my lungs. I was no longer a victim waiting to be slaughtered in my own dining room. I was the architect of their absolute, undeniable destruction. I dried my face carefully, reapplied a small amount of lip gloss to maintain appearances, and stepped back out into the bright, chaotic waiting room. Just as I took my seat next to Julian, the heavy double doors of the intensive care unit swung open once again. The same severe-looking doctor from the private consultation room walked out holding his silver medical clipboard tightly against his white coat. "Family of Valerie Davis," he called out, his voice steady and highly professional, cutting through the background noise of the hospital. Julian and Jasmine practically sprinted to the center of the room to meet him. Darnell trailed slowly behind them, his face a miserable mask of poorly concealed dread and sheer panic. "Your mother has officially stabilized," the doctor announced calmly to the group. "We were able to successfully reverse the worst effects of the severe anaphylactic shock she experienced. However, the extreme trauma to her cardiovascular system means she is currently intubated and resting in a medically induced coma. We have to allow her heart and lungs to heal without any stress. She is going to survive this ordeal, but it will be a very long, difficult road to full recovery." Jasmine immediately burst into loud theatrical tears, throwing her arms up in the air and praising God at the top of her lungs. Julian let out an incredibly long, heavy breath, rubbing his large hand forcefully over his sweating face. He looked over his shoulder at me, and I gave him a weak, highly supportive smile. But I knew the absolute nightmare was far from over for him. His mother waking up meant she could potentially talk, and that was the most dangerous variable in his entire murderous equation. Within an hour of the doctor's announcement, the news of Valerie's sudden horrific hospitalization had spread rapidly through our tight-knit African-American church community. Our head pastor, accompanied by several prominent church elders and their respective wives, arrived in the emergency waiting room, carrying well-worn Bibles and covered dishes of warm food. They clustered tightly around Julian, offering him fervent prayers and words of deep spiritual comfort. This was Julian's absolute element. He always thrived on the direct attention and the entirely misplaced admiration of his religious peers. He stood confidently in the center of the waiting room, holding his leather-bound Bible tightly against his chest, completely commanding the emotional energy of the room. "The devil truly tried to attack this righteous family tonight," Julian preached to the small crowd, his voice naturally rising and falling with the perfectly practiced cadence of a seasoned pulpit minister. "He tried his hardest to take the beloved matriarch of our family away from us. But we serve a mighty, forgiving God. We serve a God of absolute healing and divine protection." The older church members nodded enthusiastically, murmuring their loud agreements and offering quiet praises. "Family is all we truly have in this dark, unforgiving world," Julian continued passionately, wiping a single, perfectly timed tear from his cheek. "When you face the ultimate terrifying trials of life, when the violent storms try to drown you in despair, you quickly realize that your blood, your family, your devoted wife, and your unshakable faith are the only things that truly matter in the end. I am so unbelievably blessed to have my beautiful, strong wife, Chloe, standing right by my side through this horrific, traumatizing ordeal." He reached out his hand lovingly toward me. The entire room turned their sympathetic, tear-filled eyes directly in my direction. I forced my heavy legs to walk forward, taking his warm hand and letting him pull me gently into his side. "She has been my absolute rock tonight," Julian lied effortlessly to the gathered congregation. "She is the strongest, most supportive woman I have ever known." The older women in the room smiled warmly at me completely, and utterly unaware that they were looking at a man who had just actively tried to murder his own unborn child for a financial payout. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of his public speech, the sickening dark hypocrisy of his carefully chosen words, made my skin crawl with an intense burning revulsion. He was deliberately using his own mother's near-death experience to aggressively bolster his own righteous, flawless image in the community. He was playing the perfect devoted husband, while secretly calculating how to get away with my murder before the end of the month. I leaned my head gently against his broad shoulder, letting the congregation see the picture-perfect loving couple they so desperately wanted to believe in. I closed my eyes, playing the part of the exhausted faithful wife. But in my mind, I was already ruthlessly counting down the hours until Desmond delivered the financial files. Julian genuinely thought he was giving a beautiful, inspiring sermon on family loyalty and faith. He had absolutely no idea he was actually delivering his own funeral eulogy. I told Julian I needed to step out to get my phone charger and a fresh change of clothes from my car. He barely nodded, too busy accepting the misplaced sympathy of the church elders who were still huddled around him in the waiting room. I turned my back on his sickening performance, keeping my posture perfectly straight as I walked out of the intensive care unit. The moment the automatic sliding doors of the hospital lobby closed behind me, the warm, humid Atlanta night air hit my face. I walked briskly toward the concrete parking garage across the street. The heavy rhythmic click of my heels echoing in the empty, dimly lit structure was the only sound keeping me grounded in reality. My black Mercedes-Benz S-Class was parked on the secluded third level, sitting exactly where I had abandoned it hours ago when we blindly followed the ambulance. I unlocked the doors and climbed into the driver's seat. The plush leather interior, usually a symbol of my hard-earned success, felt like a sterile holding cell. I did not turn the engine on. I simply sat in the suffocating silence, staring at the concrete pillar in front of me, waiting. Exactly 12 minutes later, the passenger side door opened smoothly. Desmond slid into the seat next to me, bringing with him the faint smell of stale cigarette smoke and cheap diner coffee. He was a large, imposing man who moved with the quiet, deliberate grace of someone who had spent 30 years hunting criminals. He did not offer any meaningless pleasantries. He simply opened a thick, unmarked manila folder and placed a glowing, encrypted tablet on the center console between us. "You were absolutely right to call me Chloe," Desmond said, his gravelly voice devoid of any emotion. "I put 3 of my best forensic accountants on this the second we hung up. What they found is catastrophic. Your husband is not just a liar. He is a desperate, extremely dangerous man backed into an impossible corner." I stared at the glowing screen of the tablet. "Show me," I commanded quietly. Desmond tapped the screen, pulling up a complex web of bank statements, wire transfers, and offshore routing numbers. Let us start with the pristine reputation of his precious nonprofit organization. Desmond began, pointing a thick finger at a highlighted column of numbers. Julian's charity is supposed to be funding after-school programs for underprivileged youth in the metro area. Instead, it is functioning as his own personal piggy bank. Over the last 8 months, Julian has systematically embezzled exactly $1.5 million from the charity's main operating account. He used a series of phantom vendors and falsified invoice records to drain the funds. He thought he was being clever, but he left a digital trail a mile wide. I felt a cold wave of absolute disbelief wash over me. $1.5 million. I repeated, the sheer magnitude of the number tasting like ash in my mouth. What did he possibly do with that kind of money? We do not live an extravagant lifestyle beyond what my own real estate income easily supports. He gave it to Darnell, Desmond stated bluntly, pulling up a new document on the tablet. It was a massive spreadsheet detailing hundreds of high-volume, completely reckless cryptocurrency trades. Darnell convinced your husband that he had cracked the algorithm of a new volatile offshore crypto market. Julian handed over the stolen charity funds in staggered wire transfers, fully expecting Darnell to triple the money within weeks. Instead, Darnell lost every single penny in a catastrophic market crash 4 months ago. The money is entirely gone, evaporated into digital thin air. I closed my eyes, pressing my fingers hard against my temples. Darnell, the arrogant, loud-mouthed brother-in-law, who constantly mocked my corporate ambitions, had completely bankrupted my husband. But that did not explain the poison. That did not explain why Julian was trying to murder me at his mother's dining table. "It gets much worse," Desmond continued, his voice dropping an octave as he swiped to the next page of the report. Darnell did not just lose Julian's stolen money. In a frantic, idiotic attempt to win it all back and cover his tracks, Darnell borrowed heavily from a violent, extremely unforgiving underground syndicate based out of Chicago. He leveraged his own life and by extension Julian's life on a guaranteed return that never materialized. The loan sharks are actively threatening Darnell. We intercepted encrypted text messages from earlier today. They told Darnell that if they do not receive their money by the end of the month, they are going to start sending pieces of him to Jasmine in the mail. And they made it abundantly clear that Julian is next on their list, because he originally funded the operation. My heart slammed against my ribs. So Julian is completely broke, and the mob is actively hunting his family. I said slowly, piecing the horrific puzzle together. But how does killing me solve his financial crisis? I have money, but my assets are tied up in corporate trusts and commercial properties. He cannot just liquidate my real estate portfolio without my signature. He knows that. Desmond looked at me with an expression of deep, profound pity. It was the first time I had ever seen the hardened investigator look genuinely disturbed. He reached into the manila folder and pulled out a single, heavily redacted document. He placed it carefully on my lap. "He cannot liquidate your properties," Desmond agreed quietly. "But he can absolutely cash out this." I looked down at the document. It was an insurance policy. A massive, comprehensive life insurance policy taken out exactly 3 weeks ago. My name was listed as the primary insured. Julian's name was listed as the sole uncontested beneficiary. I stared at the payout figure printed at the bottom of the page. $5 million. The charity's board of directors is scheduled to conduct a massive independent financial audit on the 1st of next month, Desmond explained, tapping the paper. When they open those books, Julian is going to be instantly exposed. He is facing decades in federal prison for the embezzlement alone, not to mention the violent loan sharks breathing down his neck. He desperately needed a massive influx of untraceable cash, and he needed it before the audit. I felt the blood drain completely from my face. My hands began to shake violently as I held the paper. "He took out a $5 million policy on my life." I whispered the horrific reality of the situation, finally shattering my last shred of denial. "Yes," Desmond said softly. "And here is the truly demonic part of his plan, Chloe. We dug into the specific black market dealer Julian contacted for the pills. He specifically requested a massive, unrefined dose of misoprostol. The street dealer warned him that a dose that high could cause severe, unstoppable internal hemorrhaging in a pregnant woman. Julian bought it anyway." My breath caught in my throat. I looked out the dark window of the Mercedes, my mind flashing back to the dining room. The way he carefully stirred the white powder into the dark broth. The way he watched me lift the spoon to my mouth. He knew about the baby. I said, my voice sounding hollow and entirely dead. He intercepted the call from my doctor. He knew I was pregnant. Desmond nodded slowly. "If you had eaten that gumbo, you would have started bleeding out within hours. When the paramedics arrived, it would have looked like a horrific, entirely natural complication of a sudden tragic miscarriage, an ectopic pregnancy rupture, or a severe uterine hemorrhage. The doctors would have been completely focused on saving your life from a devastating reproductive emergency, not looking for a rare, untraceable chemical compound in your bloodstream. You would have bled to death in your own bed." I dropped the insurance document onto the center console as if it had physically burned my skin. The pure, unadulterated evil of his plan was staggering. He wanted to kill our unborn child and use the resulting medical trauma as the perfect, unquestionable cover to murder me. He was going to stand at my funeral wearing a sharp black suit, crying his fake, pathetic tears, while the church congregation told him how strong he was. He was going to play the grieving, devastated widower who tragically lost his beautiful wife and his unborn child on the same night. And then he was going to collect $5 million, pay back his stolen charity funds, pay off the violent loan sharks, and walk completely away as a wealthy, innocent man. He almost got away with it, I whispered to the empty car. If I had not traded those bulls out of petty spite, I would be dead right now. My baby would be dead. Desmond leaned forward, his massive hands resting on his knees. Chloe, I have a fully armed security team sitting in 2 unmarked vehicles at the perimeter of this hospital right now. Say the word, and I will personally drive you to a secure, undisclosed safe house. We can hand all of this evidence over to the FBI tonight. Julian and Darnell will be in federal custody before the sun comes up. You do not have to go back in there. You do not have to look at him ever again. I sat in the heavy silence, staring deeply at the illuminated dashboard of my car. I thought about the sheer terror I felt when the doctor told me I was pregnant. I thought about Valerie currently lying in a hospital bed with a tube down her throat because she eagerly ate the poison intended for me. I thought about Jasmine screaming in my face, calling me a jealous outsider while her own husband was bankrupting their family. And I thought about Julian, the man who kissed my forehead every morning while actively planning my violent, bloody execution. Going to the police right now was the safe, logical choice. It was the choice a normal, terrified woman would make. But I was not a normal woman. I was a woman who had built an empire from the ground up in a world designed to crush people exactly like me. If I handed this over to the authorities now, Julian would simply hire an expensive defense attorney. He would claim temporary insanity. He would blame Darnell. He would somehow find a way to manipulate the system and lessen his punishment. I did not just want him locked in a concrete cell. I wanted him entirely destroyed. I wanted him to feel the exact same blinding, suffocating terror he intended for me. I wanted to strip away his money, his reputation, his freedom, and his pathetic, arrogant pride piece by bloody piece in front of everyone he desperately wanted to impress. No, I said firmly, turning my head to look Desmond directly in the eyes. Call your security team off. I am not going to a safe house. I am going back inside that hospital. Desmond frowned deeply, his intense concern completely evident. Chloe, he is an active, desperate threat. If he realizes the poison failed, he might try something else. He is backed into a corner. He thinks the poison failed because his mother accidentally ate the wrong bowl. I corrected him coldly. He thinks I am entirely clueless. He thinks I am his naive, loving wife who is currently devastated by her mother-in-law's tragic medical emergency. I'm going to let him keep believing that until the exact moment I publicly execute his entire life. I picked up the manila folder and shoved it deep into my designer leather tote bag. I need you to do exactly as I asked Desmond. Do not contact the authorities yet. I want you to prepare the financial documents exactly as we discussed. Put a hard lock on all of my personal corporate accounts. I want you to draft the anonymous tips to the IRS and the FBI White-Collar Crime Division, but do not hit send until I give you the explicit signal. Desmond studied my face for a long, silent moment. He saw the absolute unflinching murder in my eyes. He nodded once, a gesture of profound respect. You are the boss, Chloe. But you keep your phone on you at all times. If he even looks at you wrong, you press the panic button we installed on your watch. I will have men through the front door in 90 seconds. I appreciate that, Desmond, I replied, my voice completely devoid of fear. But Julian is a coward. He only strikes when he thinks nobody is looking. I promise you, by the time I am finished with him, he is going to wish he had eaten that poison himself. Desmond slipped out of the Mercedes, melting instantly back into the dark shadows of the concrete parking garage. I sat alone for another 5 minutes, taking slow, methodical breaths to completely lower my heart rate. I placed my hands over my stomach once more, making a silent, unbreakable promise to the tiny life growing inside me. Nobody was going to hurt us. Nobody was going to take what I had bled to build. I grabbed my phone charger, stepped out of the vehicle, and locked the doors. I walked back toward the bright, sterile lights of the hospital lobby, a perfectly crafted smile already forming on my face. It was time to go back upstairs and comfort my grieving, murderous husband. I pushed through the heavy sliding glass doors of the hospital entrance, letting the freezing, sterile air of the lobby hit my face. Every single step I took toward the busy elevator bank required a massive, monumental effort of sheer will. I had to physically compartmentalize the explosive, devastating truth Desmond had just handed me. $1.5 million stolen from charity. A $5 million life insurance policy placed on my head. A targeted violent hit on my innocent unborn child. I locked all of that away securely in a dark, impenetrable vault in my mind. Right now, I desperately needed to be Chloe, the devoted, exhausted wife. The elevator dinged softly, depositing me back onto the intensive care floor. The crowd of church members had thinned out slightly, but Julian was still holding court in the corner of the waiting room. He was sitting with his elbows resting heavily on his knees, his head bowed in a picture of perfect manufactured sorrow. Jasmine was asleep in a remarkably uncomfortable plastic chair. Darnell was nowhere to be seen, likely pacing a hallway somewhere panicking about the violent loan sharks breathing down his neck. I walked over to Julian and placed my hand gently on his broad, shaking back. He jumped, slightly startled by my touch, but quickly recovered his composure. He looked up at me with deceitful, sad eyes. I handed him a bottle of water I had purchased downstairs. "You need to stay hydrated, sweetheart," I murmured softly, taking a seat directly next to him. "You have to keep your strength up for when your mother wakes up." Julian took the bottle, offering me a weak, grateful smile that made my skin crawl with violent revulsion. "Thank you, baby," he whispered, leaning his heavy head against my shoulder. "I do not know how I am holding it together right now." I stroked his arm slowly, tracing the expensive fabric of his shirt. "We will get through this tragedy together," I replied smoothly to him. We sat in that heavy, suffocating silence for nearly 45 minutes. I played the part flawlessly, rubbing his back, offering quiet words of encouragement whenever a nurse walked past. But my mind was aggressively calculating my next move. I felt my phone vibrate sharply against my thigh. It was a single intense buzz. The secure notification pattern I had set up exclusively for Desmond. I waited exactly 3 minutes to avoid appearing overly eager. Then I let out a soft, exhausted sigh and stood up. "I need to find a quiet place to pray." I told Julian, my voice appropriately solemn and thick with fake emotion. "The hospital chapel is on the second floor. I just need a moment alone to talk to God about everything that has happened tonight." Julian nodded fervently, completely approving of my pious excuse. "Take all the time you need, my love," he said, squeezing my hand tightly. "Pray for a miracle." "I will," I promised quietly. I walked briskly down the long, quiet corridors until I found the small hospital chapel. It was completely empty. The room was dimly lit by a series of small artificial candles glowing softly against the dark oak-paneled walls. A simple wooden cross hung at the front of the room. I walked straight to the back pew, sat down in the darkest corner, and pulled my phone from my pocket. I opened the encrypted messaging application. Desmond had sent a single audio file with a brief text message attached. He wrote that his tech team had successfully bypassed the cloud security backup of Valerie's vehicle dashcam. The file contained an automatically recorded conversation from 2 days ago. Julian had borrowed his mother's car to run errands. I pulled my wireless earbuds from my purse, placed them securely in my ears, and pressed play. The recording started with the heavy sound of a car door slamming shut, followed by the distinctive hum of Valerie's luxury sedan engine turning over. Then I heard my husband's voice sounding incredibly stressed and panicked. "Mom, I am completely out of options," Julian said loudly over the sound of the air conditioning. "The board is going to demand a full audit by the 1st of the month. If they see the missing funds, I am going to federal prison." Darnell lost every single dime. I felt my heart rate accelerate as I listened to the raw, unfiltered panic in his voice. Then Valerie's voice filled my ears. She did not sound shocked. She did not sound angry at her son for stealing from a charity. She sounded dangerously calm and calculating. "I told you never to trust that idiot Darnell with real money," Valerie snapped coldly. "But crying about it now will not fix the deficit. What did the street contact say about the pills?" Julian let out a long, heavy sigh. "He gave me the maximum dosage. He said it is highly unrefined, extremely potent. It is guaranteed to terminate the pregnancy, but he warned me it could easily cause a massive, fatal hemorrhage. If she bleeds out, they will just write it off as a tragic, severe ectopic rupture or a catastrophic miscarriage complication." I closed my eyes tightly in the dark chapel, feeling a fresh wave of blinding rage wash over me. I had suspected Valerie knew about the poison. I had seen the way she looked at the gumbo bowls at the dining table. But hearing her actively conspire to murder me and her own unborn grandchild was a completely different level of psychological devastation. I waited for Valerie to express even a single ounce of hesitation. I waited for the supposed devout Christian matriarch to recoil at the idea of cold-blooded murder. Instead, she laughed. It was a short, sharp, deeply cruel sound. "Good," Valerie said, her voice dripping with absolute venom and malice. "Do not let that girl tie you down forever with a child. I never wanted you to marry her in the first place. She is arrogant, she is loud, and she completely lacks the proper grace required to stand beside a man of your stature in our community." I felt my fingernails dig painfully into the palms of my hands. "My stature," Julian echoed nervously. "Mom, if this goes wrong, I lose everything. Listen to me very carefully," Julian Valerie commanded fiercely on the recording, completely dismissing his pathetic fears. "You are a pillar of this community. You are destined for greatness. You cannot let her ghetto blood pollute our family line. She thinks because she sells a few commercial buildings she is our equal. She is not. Once she is permanently out of the picture, you collect that massive life insurance payout. You quietly fix your little accounting error at the charity. You pay off those violent thugs hunting Darnell. And then, after an appropriate period of public mourning, you can finally marry Pastor Miller's daughter. That girl comes from real established generational wealth. She knows how to properly respect a husband. She knows how to submit." Julian was quiet for a long moment. "You really think this will work?" he finally asked, his voice sounding small and weak. "Of course it will work," Valerie replied confidently. "You just bring the powder to Sunday dinner. I will make my special seafood gumbo. I will plate the food myself in the kitchen and make sure her bowl gets the extra seasoning. We will eat, she will get violently ill later that night, and you will play the tragic, helpless husband. It is foolproof." The audio file ended abruptly with the sound of the turn signal clicking rhythmically in the background. I sat in the dark, silent chapel staring blankly at the glowing wooden cross at the front of the room. The absolute staggering reality of their conversation settled into my bones like heavy lead. Valerie was not a tragic victim of a terrible misunderstanding. She was the architect of my execution. She had actively planned to serve me a bowl of death in her own home, sitting at the head of the table like a benevolent queen while she watched me eat it. She hated me so deeply, so fundamentally, that she was entirely willing to murder her own unborn grandchild just to ensure I was completely erased from their prestigious family portrait. She wanted to replace me with a more submissive, wealthier woman who fit her twisted narrative of the perfect Christian wife. She literally ate her own trap. She was currently fighting for her life in a medically induced coma because she tried to murder me and failed spectacularly. I pulled the wireless earbuds from my ears and placed them carefully back into my designer purse. The lingering sadness completely vanished. The betrayal no longer hurt. It just fueled a massive, uncontrollable inferno of pure vengeance. Nobody in this toxic family was getting out unscathed. I stood up slowly, adjusting my skirt, and walked out. The dim, peaceful silence of the hospital chapel faded behind me as I navigated the bright, sterile corridors back toward the intensive care unit. My mind was no longer a swirling vortex of shock and betrayal. It had hardened into a solid block of cold, calculated precision. I knew exactly who these people were now. I knew what they valued, I knew what they feared, and most importantly, I knew exactly how desperate they were. When I pushed through the heavy double doors of the waiting room, the atmosphere had drastically shifted. The church elders had finally gone home, leaving only Julian, Jasmine, and Darnell. They were clustered tightly together near the nurse's station, speaking in rapid, hushed tones. As I approached, the automatic doors of the ICU slid open, and the lead attending physician stepped out, pulling his blue surgical mask down around his neck. Julian practically sprinted across the linoleum floor to reach him. "Is there a change?" Julian demanded, his voice thick with a chaotic mixture of desperate hope and poorly concealed terror. The doctor offered a small professional smile. "Yes, there is a significant change," the doctor replied calmly. "Your mother is awake. We have successfully removed the breathing tube. She is still incredibly weak, and her throat is severely inflamed from the intubation, but she is conscious and responsive. She is going to survive." Jasmine let out a piercing shriek of joy, throwing her arms around Darnell. Darnell offered a weak, unconvincing smile, his eyes darting nervously toward the exit. I watched Julian carefully. His broad shoulders slumped slightly. It was a complex physical reaction. He was relieved that he was not officially a murderer, but he was simultaneously terrified of what his mother might say now that she could speak. I immediately rushed to his side, wrapping my arms around his waist and burying my face into his shoulder. "Thank God," I cried out, forcing my voice to tremble with manufactured relief. "Oh, Julian, our prayers were answered." The doctor held up a hand to calm the sudden celebration. "Please understand, she has been through a massive trauma," the doctor warned us strictly. "Her heart rate is still dangerously erratic. I will allow a brief visit, but only immediate family and only for a few minutes. You cannot overwhelm her." Julian and Jasmine immediately pushed past the doctor, desperate to get to Valerie's bedside. I followed closely behind them, eager to see the defeated face of the woman who had casually plotted my death. When we entered the small, dimly lit hospital room, the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor dominated the heavy silence. Valerie looked absolutely terrible. Her usually perfectly coiffed hair was a matted, sweaty mess against the thin hospital pillow. Her skin, normally a warm, rich brown, was pale and ashen. Deep purple bags hung heavily under her eyes, and an array of plastic tubes and wires connected her fragile body to the towering medical machines beside the bed. Jasmine immediately burst into loud, dramatic tears, rushing to the side of the bed and grabbing her mother's frail hand. "Mom, we were so incredibly scared." Jasmine sobbed loudly, completely ignoring the doctor's explicit instructions not to overwhelm her. Julian stood on the other side of the bed, his face pale and tense. He leaned down, placing his hand over his mother's arm. "We are all here, Mom," Julian whispered intensely, staring directly into her eyes with a hidden, desperate warning. "Everything is fine. We are handling everything. You just need to rest." Valerie blinked slowly, her heavily drugged eyes slowly panning across the room until they finally landed on me. I stood at the foot of her bed, my hands clasped politely in front of me, wearing an expression of deep, loving concern. When her eyes locked onto mine, I saw a terrifying flash of raw, unfiltered hatred burn through the heavy haze of the medical sedatives. She knew exactly what had happened. She knew I had deliberately swapped those bowls, and she knew she had swallowed her own toxic, murderous trap. But she also knew she was entirely powerless right now. She could not speak. She could not accuse me without confessing to her own horrific crimes. I smiled warmly at her, letting my eyes remain completely devoid of any real empathy. "I am so glad you pulled through, Valerie," I said softly, ensuring my voice sounded perfectly sweet and innocent. "Sunday dinner just would not be the same without you." Valerie's heart monitor immediately spiked the steady beeping, accelerating into a rapid, frantic rhythm. The attending nurse quickly stepped into the room, ushering us all toward the door. "That is enough excitement for now," the nurse stated firmly, waving us out. "She needs absolute quiet. You all need to step outside so she can rest." Julian practically dragged Jasmine out of the room. I followed them back out into the bright hallway. Now that the immediate medical crisis had officially passed, the brutal reality of their impending financial doom settled heavily over the three of them. Darnell was pacing the hallway, chewing aggressively on his thumbnail. "We need to talk," Julian announced suddenly, his voice tight and authoritative. He looked at me, then gestured toward the elevator bank. "Let us go down to the cafeteria. We need to figure out the logistics of Mom's recovery." We rode the elevator down to the basement level in complete silence. The hospital cafeteria was mostly empty at this hour, illuminated by harsh, buzzing neon lights and smelling faintly of stale coffee and old grease. We found a large, secluded booth in the far back corner. I sat on one side next to Julian, while Jasmine and Darnell slid into the opposite side. Darnell could not sit still. His knee bounced violently under the table, a clear physical manifestation of the violent loan sharks breathing down his neck. Julian folded his large hands on the cheap laminate table, leaning forward with a deeply serious manufactured expression of profound grief. "Chloe," he began, his voice dropping into a soft, manipulative cadence. "The doctor pulled me aside while you were in the chapel. The news is not good regarding the finances. Because Mom's condition was so severe, they had to use experimental treatments and out-of-network specialists to reverse the anaphylaxis. Her standard Medicare policy is absolutely refusing to cover the emergency interventions. They are threatening to transfer her to a state-funded low-income facility by tomorrow morning, unless we can prove we have the liquid assets to cover her ongoing intensive care." I kept my face perfectly neutral, actively suppressing the urge to laugh directly in his face. It was a brilliant, completely fabricated lie. Desmond had already confirmed that Julian needed exactly $1.5 million to replace his stolen charity funds, plus whatever massive sum Darnell owed the Chicago syndicate. They were attempting to extort me to save their own pathetic lives, using Valerie's self-inflicted medical emergency as the perfect emotional leverage. "How much do they need, Julian?" I asked quietly, playing the role of the deeply concerned, supportive spouse. Julian swallowed hard, exchanging a rapid, desperate glance with Darnell. "To keep her in the premium cardiac recovery unit, and to cover the specialized private care she is going to need for the next 6 months. The hospital is demanding a massive upfront deposit," Julian explained smoothly, never breaking eye contact with me. "They need $400,000 by tomorrow afternoon. I would never ask you this if there was any other way, baby. But my charity assets are completely tied up in long-term community trusts, and Darnell's crypto investments are locked in a 90-day maturation cycle. You are the only one with immediate access to that kind of liquid corporate capital." I slowly let out a trembling breath, bringing my hand up to my mouth, as if I were entirely overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the number. "Julian, that is nearly $500,000, I whispered in fake shock. "That is not just sitting in my personal checking account. That is the primary operating capital for my commercial real estate brokerage. That money is designated for payroll, corporate taxes, and closing escrows." Jasmine slammed both of her hands violently onto the cafeteria table. The loud smack echoed sharply through the empty room. "Do not give us your corporate excuses, Chloe," Jasmine hissed, her face contorting with a deep, ugly rage. "This is our mother's life we are talking about. You sit in your fancy office playing pretend business mogul, completely forgetting who elevated you to this level." I turned my head slowly to look at her. "What exactly do you mean by that, Jasmine? You were absolutely nothing before Julian married you." Jasmine spat venomously, leaning aggressively across the table, completely abandoning the fake loving sister act. "You came from a broken working-class background. Our family gave you a respectable name. We brought you into a prominent church community. We gave you the high-class social connections you desperately needed to build your little real estate empire. You owe this family. You owe my mother. You are going to sign that money over, or everyone in Atlanta is going to find out exactly how ungrateful and selfish you truly are." Julian did not stop her. He did not defend me. He simply let his sister play the aggressive attack dog, hoping her vicious guilt trip would mentally break me down and force me to submit. Darnell nodded vigorously in agreement, his eyes wide with a frantic, animalistic desperation. They were trying to back me into a psychological corner, relying heavily on the tired, toxic stereotype that the successful Black woman must endlessly sacrifice her own hard-earned wealth to support the failures of her extended family. I bit the inside of my cheek hard enough to taste copper, using the physical pain to completely mask the volcanic rage boiling in my blood. I looked down at my hands, letting my shoulders slump forward in a posture of complete devastating defeat. I allowed a long, agonizing silence to stretch across the table. I let them believe they had successfully broken my spirit. "You are right," I finally whispered, my voice sounding hollow and completely broken. "Family has to come first. I cannot let Valerie be transferred to a state facility after everything she has done for me." Julian let out a massive, shuddering breath of relief. His entire body relaxed against the vinyl booth. "I knew I could count on you, baby," he said smoothly, reaching over to squeeze my hand. "You are saving my mother's life." I slowly pulled my hand away from his grasp, sitting up slightly straighter. "But I cannot just wire $400,000 out of a corporate brokerage account without triggering a massive federal tax audit," I explained, forcing my voice to sound deeply apologetic and purely practical. "My corporate attorney Marcus has to legally authorize any transfer over $50,000. It is a strict fraud protection protocol built into my business accounts. I need the official hospital invoices, the out-of-network denial letters from her insurance company, and the medical transfer request forms." Julian frowned deeply, a flash of intense panic returning to his dark eyes. "Chloe, we do not have time for corporate red tape. We need the cash tomorrow." "I know, sweetheart," I replied soothingly, looking at him with wide, completely innocent eyes. "And if you give me those official documents right now, I will personally drive them to Marcus's office first thing in the morning. He will expedite the wire transfer directly to the hospital billing department before noon. But without that paperwork, the bank will freeze my accounts for suspicious activity, and then nobody gets anything." Julian stared at me, his jaw clenching aggressively. He knew he could not produce those documents because the hospital was not demanding a single dime. The debt belonged entirely to the violent loan sharks currently hunting Darnell. But he also knew he could not argue against standard corporate banking laws without exposing his own massive, desperate lie. "Fine," Julian spat out, his voice tight with immense frustration. "I will go upstairs to the billing department right now and get the official paperwork. But you better make sure your lawyer pushes this through tomorrow, Chloe. This is a matter of life and death." "It certainly is, Julian," I agreed quietly, the double meaning of my words completely lost on his arrogant mind. I picked up my designer purse and slid gracefully out of the cafeteria booth. "You get the papers. I am going to go home, take a quick shower, and prepare the authorization forms. I will see you at the house." I turned my back on the three of them, leaving them sitting in the harsh neon glow of their own impending destruction. I walked out of the hospital into the dark, humid night, my mind already executing the devastating financial bloodbath I was about to unleash. The drive back to our sprawling suburban home was a blur of neon streetlights and cold calculation. When I pulled my Mercedes into the pristine driveway, the house looked exactly the same as it had on Sunday evening. The porch lights cast a warm, welcoming glow over the manicured lawn. But to me, it was no longer a home. It was an active crime scene. I unlocked the heavy mahogany front door, bypassed the kitchen where Valerie had prepared her toxic gumbo, and walked straight up the stairs to my private home office. I locked the solid oak door securely behind me, booted up my secure desktop computer, and poured myself a tall glass of sparkling water. The time for playing the weeping compliant wife was officially over. I had exactly 48 hours before Julian expected me to hand over $400,000. I was going to spend every single second of that time systematically dismantling his entire existence. My first target was our personal finances. Julian and I maintained a large joint checking and savings account at a premium national bank. It was supposed to be our emergency fund and household operating account. Over the years, I had deposited hundreds of thousands of dollars into those accounts from my real estate commissions, while Julian contributed a meager fraction from his nonprofit salary. I logged into the banking portal, my fingers flying rapidly across the mechanical keyboard. With a few quick clicks, I initiated a massive wire transfer. I drained every single penny of my contributed funds, routing the money directly into a secure private offshore holding account Desmond had helped me establish years ago. I left exactly $1.50 in the joint checking account. It was just enough to keep the account active, so Julian would not receive an automatic closure notification, but absolutely useless to a man desperate to pay off the Chicago mob. Next, I systematically removed myself as an authorized user from all of his personal credit cards. I canceled the premium black card he proudly flashed at expensive steakhouses, reporting it lost, and permanently locking the credit line. I froze my own credit with all three major bureaus, ensuring he could not desperately open any new lines of debt in my name. By the time the digital clock on my desk flashed 3 in the morning, Julian's financial safety net was completely obliterated. He just did not know it yet. At 7 o'clock the next morning, I was already sitting in the sleek glass-walled downtown office of my lead corporate attorney, Marcus. Marcus was a brilliant, ruthless lawyer who had guided me through my toughest commercial acquisitions. When I walked in, he immediately noticed the dark circles under my eyes and the icy, unyielding set of my jaw. I handed him a heavily encrypted flash drive containing the preliminary financial data Desmond had uncovered. Marcus plugged it into his secure terminal. As his eyes scanned the staggering evidence of Julian's embezzlement and Darnell's massive cryptocurrency failures, his professional demeanor shifted into pure aggressive combat mode. I told him exactly what Valerie and Julian had attempted to do at Sunday dinner. Marcus did not offer empty sympathy. He immediately pulled out a thick stack of legal pads and started drafting the ultimate defensive perimeter. We spent the next 9 hours executing a flawlessly coordinated legal maneuver. I legally transferred complete ownership of my commercial real estate brokerage, all 6 of my lucrative downtown office buildings, and the deed to the suburban house Julian and I currently lived in, into an impenetrable, irrevocable blind trust. I named myself as the sole beneficiary, but legally stripped away my own direct immediate control of the assets on paper. It was an ironclad financial fortress. Even if Julian somehow managed to forge my signature, or if the loan sharks tried to violently extort me, the assets were entirely locked behind layers of complex corporate law. The trust could not be touched, liquidated, or leveraged without the unanimous approval of a completely independent board of trustees. When I signed the final heavily notarized document, a massive weight lifted off my chest. My empire was entirely safe, but securing my own assets was only the first half of my operation. The second half was pure, unadulterated retaliation. I left Marcus's office late Tuesday afternoon and drove directly to a small, completely anonymous internet cafe on the outskirts of the city. I paid in cash, sat at a corner terminal, and logged into the ghost email account I shared with Desmond. He had delivered exactly as promised. The inbox was loaded with massive, meticulously organized digital dossiers. I spent the next 4 hours downloading, printing, and categorizing the absolute worst mistakes my husband and his brother-in-law had ever made. The first stack of papers was a masterpiece of federal tax fraud. Desmond's forensic accountants had mapped out every single fake invoice Julian used to drain the $1.5 million from his charity. They included the original operating budgets, the falsified vendor contracts, and the exact offshore routing numbers where the money ultimately landed. It was a perfect, undeniably clear paper trail that proved Julian had willfully and maliciously defrauded a registered nonprofit organization. It was enough evidence to secure a guaranteed federal indictment. The second stack of papers belonged entirely to Darnell. It detailed his pathetic, frantic cryptocurrency trading logs. It showed exactly how he had taken Julian's stolen charity funds, funneled them through unregulated digital wallets, and lost every single dime in a highly volatile, highly illegal offshore trading platform. Desmond had even managed to pull the IP addresses Darnell used to execute the trades, proving beyond any reasonable doubt that the transactions originated from Darnell's own laptop in Jasmine's living room. But the absolute crown jewel of the evidence was the transcribed text messages between Darnell and the Chicago syndicate. The messages explicitly outlined the massive debt, the violent threats against Jasmine, and the strict timeline for repayment. It proved Darnell was actively engaged with known organized crime figures across state lines. I organized the documents into two thick, incredibly damning folders. I did not include any personal notes. I did not need to explain the story. The raw numbers and the verified bank routing codes told a perfectly terrifying tale of corporate greed, grand larceny, and severe financial fraud. The evidence was so complete, so perfectly packaged, that any junior agent could pick it up and secure an arrest warrant within hours. I placed the folders into two large, heavy-duty cardboard shipping envelopes. I printed the shipping labels using a prepaid, completely untraceable digital debit card. The first package was addressed directly to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service in Washington. The IRS does not play games with nonprofit tax fraud, and I knew they would immediately freeze the charity's accounts the second they reviewed the fake invoices. The second, much thicker package was addressed to the Regional Field Office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specifically marked for the White-Collar Crime and Organized Crime Task Force. As the sun began to set on Tuesday evening, casting long, dark shadows across the busy Atlanta streets, I walked into a crowded, automated shipping center. I did not wear a disguise, but I wore a large pair of designer sunglasses and kept my head down to avoid any casual conversation. I slipped both heavy packages into the overnight drop box. The heavy metal door clanged shut, echoing loudly in the quiet storefront. It was the sound of a heavy prison door locking securely into place. I had just launched a catastrophic, unavoidable federal investigation that would completely decimate my husband's life, his freedom, and his entire arrogant family. My phone vibrated sharply in my purse. It was a text message from Julian. He was asking if Marcus had successfully cleared the $400,000 wire transfer yet. He claimed the hospital billing department was breathing down his neck, threatening to forcefully evict his mother from the premium cardiac unit if they did not have the cash by Wednesday morning. He added a sickeningly sweet emoji telling me how much he loved me, and how he could not survive this nightmare without my strength. I stared at the glowing screen, a cold, ruthless smile spreading across my face. I typed a quick, entirely reassuring response. I told him Marcus had filed all the necessary paperwork, but the bank required a mandatory 24-hour security hold on a transfer of that massive size. I promised him the money would officially clear tomorrow afternoon, just in time for the massive Thanksgiving and healing dinner he was planning to host at our house. I told him to focus entirely on his mother's recovery and let me handle the heavy financial lifting. He replied instantly with a series of praying hands and heart emojis. He genuinely believed he had won. He thought he had successfully manipulated his wealthy, foolish wife into paying off his violent debts. He thought his mother was going to make a miraculous recovery. His charity audit would be perfectly clean, and he would eventually find another way to murder me and collect his $5 million insurance payout. He had absolutely no idea that while he was holding court in the hospital waiting room, preaching to the church elders about the sacred bonds of family, I was quietly pulling the financial floorboards out from underneath his feet. I walked back to my car, the humid air finally feeling refreshing against my skin. The trap was completely set. The evidence was in the mail. My assets were completely untouchable. All that was left to do was smile, serve dinner, and watch the entire arrogant family burn to the ground. Wednesday morning arrived with a suffocating humidity that perfectly mirrored the dark tension settling over my life. I dressed carefully in a tailored navy blue pantsuit, applying my makeup with the surgical precision of a soldier preparing for warfare. I drove my Mercedes back to Atlanta Medical Center, carrying a folder of completely blank documents to satisfy Julian's desperate illusion. When I walked into the premium cardiac recovery unit, the atmosphere was sickeningly cheerful. Valerie had been moved into a private, spacious recovery suite. Julian was sitting next to her bed, holding her hand and laughing softly, while Darnell hovered. When Julian saw me enter, his dark eyes instantly dropped to the leather portfolio securely held in my hand. He offered me a brilliant fake smile, genuinely believing his financial salvation had arrived. I kissed his cheek, playing the obedient wife, and whispered that Marcus had successfully processed the wire transfer. I told him the hospital billing department would see the funds clear by 4 p.m. this afternoon. The immense relief that washed over Julian's face was almost comical. He squeezed my waist tightly, completely blind to the federal net closing around his throat. Just as Julian finally praised God, a polite knock echoed from the door. The heavy wooden door swung open, and in walked Serena Miller. Serena was the 26-year-old daughter of our head pastor. She was the exact woman Valerie had excitedly mentioned on the hidden dashcam recording. The chosen woman with the supposed generational wealth and the submissive, perfect Christian attitude. She stepped into the hospital room carrying a massive, incredibly expensive arrangement of white lilies and pink roses. She wore a modest but perfectly fitted designer sundress, her dark hair styled in flawless soft curls. The exact moment she crossed the threshold, the dynamic in the room completely shifted. Valerie, who had been glaring at me with silent, venomous hatred just moments before, suddenly lit up with a warm, welcoming smile. Julian immediately stood up, his posture straightening aggressively as he rushed over to greet her. He took the heavy crystal vase from her hands, his fingers lingering on hers for a fraction of a second too long. Serena beamed at him, her eyes shining with an inappropriate, overly familiar adoration that made my stomach completely turn. She walked right past me. She then went straight to Valerie's bedside. "Oh, Miss Valerie, we have been praying so fiercely for your swift recovery," Serena cooed softly, placing her manicured hand over Valerie's pale arm. "My father had the entire congregation on their knees last night. The church just is not the same without our beautiful matriarch confidently leading the women's ministry." Valerie patted Serena's hand affectionately, her eyes glowing with maternal approval. "Thank you, my sweet girl." Valerie rasped, her voice still hoarse from the breathing tube. "Your presence here brings me such immense joy today. You always know exactly how to brighten a room." Serena turned around slowly and finally acknowledged completely my existence standing near the foot of the bed. She looked me up and down, a condescending, deeply pitying smile actively playing on her glossy lips. "Chloe, you poor thing," Serena said, stepping closer to me and placing a hand lightly on my shoulder. "You must be completely exhausted. Julian told me how stressed you have been lately with your little real estate business. It is so admirable how you are trying to stubbornly handle all of this family trauma on your own. You are so incredibly strong handling all this chaotic turmoil. I do not know how you even manage to consistently keep up appearances. Most women would have completely broken down by now, but you always wear that tough, impenetrable armor. It must be so incredibly draining to never let your guard down and just be a vulnerable woman." It was an absolute masterclass in backhanded Southern insults. She was loudly calling me masculine, emotionally closed off, and completely unsuited for the traditional nurturing role of a wife. She was boldly marking her territory right in front of me, entirely confident that Valerie and Julian fully supported her hostile takeover of my marriage. Julian shifted very uncomfortably, clearly recognizing the sharp tension, but he did not utter a single word to defend his wife. He simply stood there holding her stupid flowers, looking between the two of us like an absolute coward. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of the burning rage I felt inside. I simply smiled, a cold, predatory smile that absolutely did not reach my eyes. "Thank you for your profound concern, Serena," I replied smoothly, my voice perfectly measured and calm. "It certainly takes a very specific type of powerful woman to truly handle the immense pressures of this family. I am just doing exactly what any devoted, legally bound wife would do." I checked my gold watch, acting completely unbothered by her petty high school mean girl tactics. Actually, I need to go down to the cafeteria to grab a fresh coffee before I head back to my downtown office. Serena, why do you not politely walk with me to the elevator? I would absolutely love to hear more about how the church congregation is doing. Serena hesitated for a brief moment, her eyes darting quickly toward Julian for silent permission. Julian eagerly nodded, encouragingly, likely thinking I was genuinely trying to bond with the beloved pastor's daughter. Serena plastered her fake, overly sweet smile firmly back onto her face. I would absolutely love to, Chloe, she agreed happily. We walked out of the hospital room together, leaving Julian and his toxic family behind. We walked down the bright, sterile hallway side by side in complete, absolute silence. Serena kept her head held high, radiating a smug sense of victory. She genuinely believed she had already won the war. She honestly thought she was casually escorting the very defeated, soon-to-be-discarded wife completely out of this building. When we finally reached the elevator bank, I pressed the call button. The heavy metal doors slid open immediately. The car was completely empty. We stepped inside and I pressed the button for the main lobby. The doors slid shut, sealing us entirely inside a small, soundproof metal box moving rapidly down the shaft. The exact second the mechanical gears engaged and the elevator began its descent, I dropped the polite, exhausted wife facade entirely. I turned my entire body to face her directly. I aggressively stepped completely into her personal space, forcing her to rapidly back up until her shoulder blades hit the cold metal wall of the elevator. The arrogant smile instantly vanished from her face, completely replaced by a look of sheer, undeniable panic. You listened to me very carefully, Serena. I said, my voice dropping into a lethal clinical whisper that echoed sharply in the small space. I know exactly who you are. I know exactly what you and Julian have been doing behind my back. And I know exactly what Valerie promised you once I was completely removed from the picture. Serena's mouth opened and closed silently like a suffocating fish. The color drained from her face. Chloe, I do not know what you are talking about, she stammered weakly, clutching her expensive designer purse against her chest like a protective shield. I held up my hand, cutting her pathetic lie off immediately. Stop lying, I commanded coldly. I do not care about your pathetic affair. You can absolutely have him. But before you start eagerly planning your lavish church wedding, I think you should know exactly what kind of prize you are winning today. Serena froze her eyes wide with complete terror. Julian is entirely broke, Serena stated bluntly, letting the heavy words hit her like a physical blow. He does not have a single dime to his name. In fact, he is currently $1.5 million in debt. He maliciously embezzled the money from his own nonprofit charity to fund his brother-in-law's illegal cryptocurrency addiction. The Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation are currently reviewing his falsified financial documents as we speak. They will be issuing federal arrest warrants within the very next few days. Serena let out a sharp, involuntary gasp. Her knees actually buckled slightly, but the metal wall behind her held her up. But the federal agents are not the worst part, I continued mercilessly. Julian and Darnell borrowed heavily from a violent, organized crime syndicate in Chicago. Those dangerous men are actively threatening to physically dismember family members if they do not get their money by Friday. The elevator car chimed loudly, revealing the bright hospital entrance. He is all yours, I said calmly. Have a blessed day. Serena completely abandoned her pristine composure and sprinted toward the glass exit doors. One massive piece of Julian's pathetic backup plan was entirely destroyed forever today. By Friday morning, the local hospital officially discharged Valerie. She was rolled out through the sliding doors in a wheelchair, masking her malice with the fragile demeanor of a survivor. Julian was right by her side, beaming with unearned pride. He genuinely believed my lawyer had successfully processed his phantom wire transfer. He thought the loan sharks were paid off and his charity accounts reloaded. His relief manifested into a sickening display of grandiosity. He insisted we host a massive Thanksgiving dinner at our house on Saturday evening. He framed it as a gathering to praise God for saving his mother. I knew the real reason. He wanted to parade his mother in front of the church elders to solidify his reputation before the board audit. I did not argue. I simply smiled, handed him my premium corporate credit card for the expensive catering, and told him to invite absolutely anyone he wanted. Saturday evening arrived with a heavy, suffocating southern heat. My sprawling suburban home, the house I had purchased with my own blood, sweat, and tears, was completely transformed into a lively banquet hall. Julian had hired a professional event team to set up long tables adorned with crisp white linens and expensive floral centerpieces across the entire length of the formal dining room and spilling out onto the enclosed patio. By exactly 7 in the evening, nearly 40 people had arrived. The guest list included the most prominent members of our congregation, several wealthy charity board members, and of course his extended family. Jasmine strutted through my front door wearing a tight cocktail dress, acting as if she owned the floorboards beneath her feet. Darnell followed closely, but his usual swagger was gone. His face was pale, his eyes darted frantically, and his forehead was slick with sweat. The Chicago syndicate had given him until Friday to pay. It was now Saturday night. Darnell knew the money never arrived. He knew the loan sharks were hunting him, and he was desperately trying to figure out how to break the news to Julian without getting assaulted in my living room. He spent the entire morning vomiting violently in my downstairs bathroom, paralyzed by the threatening text messages lighting up his burner phone. Pastor Miller arrived shortly after, looking incredibly tense. His daughter Serena was noticeably absent. When Julian eagerly asked about her, Pastor Miller offered a stiff excuse about Serena suddenly leaving town for an urgent spiritual retreat. I stood near the kitchen island sipping sparkling water, watching Julian's face briefly register confusion before his ego smoothed it over. He simply assumed Serena was overwhelmed by her deep feelings for him. He had absolutely no idea she was running as far away from his impending federal indictment as humanly possible. Then Valerie made her grand entrance. Julian practically carried her through the front door. She was dressed in a silk gown, leaning heavily on a wooden cane. The entire room erupted into thunderous applause. The church elders rushed forward, laying hands on her shoulders and offering dramatic prayers of thanksgiving. Valerie soaked up the adoration like a parched sponge. She cast a brief venomous glare in my direction when nobody was looking, but quickly shifted her face back into a benevolent smile for her religious audience. She was still incredibly weak, but her overwhelming arrogance gave her a temporary surge of toxic energy. She genuinely believed her near-death experience had officially cemented her status as the untouchable queen of our community. I smiled back at her, a cold smile that promised ruin. The catered dinner was a chaotic symphony of clinking silver forks, loud laughter, and aggressive bragging. The catering staff moved silently around the tables, pouring expensive imported wine into crystal glasses and serving generous portions of roasted lamb and seasoned vegetables. Julian sat at the absolute head of the main table, positioning himself as the undisputed patriarch of the entire gathering. He loudly regaled the wealthy charity board members with completely fabricated stories of his daily hospital vigils. He talked passionately about the vital importance of community service, aggressively laying the groundwork for his upcoming audit. I sat quietly near the middle of the table, playing the exhausted but deeply supportive wife. I politely passed the warm dinner rolls and kept my facial expressions perfectly neutral. As the main course was finally cleared away by the serving staff, the atmosphere in the room grew heavy with anticipation. Julian stood up abruptly, tapping his heavy silver spoon aggressively against his crystal water glass. The sharp, piercing sound cut through the loud conversations, demanding immediate silence from the 40 guests filling my home. The room quieted down almost instantly. Every single face turned toward my husband. Julian adjusted his expensive silk tie, cleared his throat loudly, and looked around the room with a deeply manufactured expression of profound humility and overwhelming gratitude. Friends, family, and esteemed elders, Julian began, his voice booming with the perfectly practiced resonance of a Sunday morning sermon. We are gathered here tonight to celebrate a literal miracle. Just a few short days ago, the devil tried to violently steal the absolute rock of our family. But through the incredible power of your dedicated prayers and the unshakable grace of God, my beautiful mother is sitting right here with us tonight." Loud murmurs of agreement and sudden applause rippled through the dining room. Valerie bowed her head, dabbing at her dry eyes with a white linen napkin. Julian raised his hand, signaling for the room to quiet down once again. This terrifying ordeal has deeply reminded me of what truly matters in this life. Julian continued, his tone shifting into something intensely manipulative and dark. "It reminded me that our time on this earth is painfully short, and we must do absolutely everything in our power to give back to the community that supports us. We must be willing to sacrifice our own material wealth to ensure the less fortunate are adequately cared for." He genuinely believed that exposing my wealth to the entire church congregation would legally bind my hands. He thought I would be far too embarrassed and heavily pressured to cause a scene in my own dining room. He paused dramatically, slowly turning his body to look directly at me. His dark eyes locked onto mine, burning with a greedy, desperate intensity. I knew exactly what he was doing. He was cornering me. He reached into the inside pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick, cream-colored legal folder. "My beautiful wife Chloe has been my absolute anchor through this horrifying storm," Julian announced loudly, ensuring every single person in the room could hear him clearly. "She has witnessed firsthand the incredible fragility of human life. And because her heart is so completely full of gratitude for my mother's miraculous recovery, Chloe has decided to make an unprecedented, truly massive sacrifice to honor God tonight." A sudden, uncomfortable silence fell heavily over the room. Jasmine leaned forward in her chair, a malicious, knowing smirk spreading across her face. Darnell stopped violently bouncing his leg and stared at the legal folder in Julian's hands. Julian began walking slowly down the length of the dining table, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. He stopped right behind my chair. He reached over my shoulder and placed the thick legal folder directly onto the table in front of me. He flipped the cover open, revealing a stack of complex, densely worded real estate transfer documents. An expensive black ink pen was clipped to the top of the pages. "Chloe has generously agreed to legally transfer the complete ownership of two of her most lucrative downtown commercial properties directly into my nonprofit charity organization," Julian declared to the shocked crowd. "These massive assets will provide millions of dollars in sustained funding for our underprivileged youth programs. It is a monumental gift of faith, a true testament to her profound love for this family, and a beautiful offering to the Lord for sparing my mother's precious life." The room erupted. The charity board members gasped audibly, completely stunned by the sheer magnitude of the supposed donation. The church elders immediately began clapping, nodding their heads in deep, profound approval of my supposed spiritual generosity. Valerie watched me from the head of the table, her eyes glittering with unrestrained triumph. She genuinely thought they had finally broken me. She thought the intense public pressure of 40 deeply religious community members would force me to silently sign away my hard-earned corporate empire just to maintain my pristine reputation as a devoted, submissive wife. Julian leaned down, pressing his chest heavily against my back. He unclipped the black ink pen and placed it deliberately into my right hand. His thick fingers closed tightly over mine, a silent, aggressive physical threat disguised as a loving marital gesture. I looked down at the shiny black pen resting heavily in my palm. I felt the cold, smooth plastic directly against my bare skin, representing the complete and utter destruction of absolutely everything I had spent 10 brutal years building from the ground up. "Go ahead, my love," Julian whispered directly into my ear, his hot breath making the hair on the back of my neck stand up. His voice was completely devoid of any real affection. It was a cold, hard, and deeply menacing command that he fully expected me to blindly obey without question. "Sign the papers right now, Chloe. Show absolutely everyone here exactly how much you truly love this family." The rhythmic clapping of 40 eager guests echoed loudly off the formal dining room walls, creating a suffocating, almost cult-like pressure that completely filled the entire space. They were all staring directly at me with bright, expectant eyes, eagerly waiting for the wealthy, obedient wife to perform her final act of complete financial submission. Julian kept his heavy, sweating hand clamped tightly over my right shoulder, his thick fingers digging painfully into my collarbone through the thin fabric of my tailored dress. He was physically pinning me to the heavy wooden chair, ensuring I could not suddenly stand up or attempt to walk away from the table. From the absolute head of the long banquet table, Valerie watched me with a deeply sickening expression of utter unrestrained triumph. She was leaning forward heavily on her elbows, her frail hands clasped tightly together under her chin, as if she were deeply engaged in a holy prayer. But her dark eyes glittered with malicious, predatory joy. She genuinely believed her grand, terrifying plan had worked flawlessly. She honestly thought she had broken my spirit so completely during the hospital nightmare that I was about to willingly hand over millions of dollars to the very man who maliciously tried to murder our unborn child. I slowly lowered my gaze to the thick, cream-colored legal document resting on the pristine white linen tablecloth. The text was incredibly dense, filled with complex legal jargon, explicitly designed to immediately transfer the irrevocable deeds of my two largest, most lucrative commercial properties directly into his fraudulent charity operating account. The papers were completely flawless, drafted by a highly expensive attorney who clearly did not ask Julian any questions about where the sudden real estate donation was originating from. I reached out with my right hand and picked up the heavy, expensive black ink pen he had provided. The cold metal barrel felt completely foreign against my skin, like a heavy weapon deliberately placed in my hand to facilitate my own financial suicide. I held the pen suspended over the designated signature line for a long, agonizing moment. The loud clapping around the room slowly began to die down, quickly replaced by a thick, breathless anticipation. Julian leaned in even closer, his jaw violently tense, his entire body visibly vibrating with an ugly, greedy desperation. He genuinely thought I was simply reading the fine print. He thought I was just hesitating out of natural reluctance before ultimately surrendering my entire hard-earned corporate empire to his absolute control. He thought he had completely won the war. I raised my head slowly, bypassing my husband entirely, and locked my eyes directly onto Valerie's smug, arrogant face at the far end of the table. I let her clearly see the absolute freezing clarity in my intense stare. I did not look like a broken, grieving wife desperate to save her mother-in-law. I looked like an apex predator who had just locked the cage doors from the inside. I held her gaze firmly, refusing to blink, refusing to look away as I slowly moved my right hand entirely off the edge of the dining table. I deliberately opened my fingers completely. The heavy black ink pen slipped instantly from my grasp. It fell rapidly through the empty air and hit the solid hardwood floor with a sharp, incredibly loud clatter that violently pierced the sudden, heavy silence of the room. The pen rolled quickly underneath the table, completely out of sight and entirely out of reach. I sat back perfectly straight in my chair, adjusting my posture to radiate absolute, unyielding authority. "No," I said loudly. My voice was not shaking. It was not quiet, submissive, or remotely hesitant. It was a clear, ringing command that carried effortlessly across the entire dining room, echoing sharply off the high ceilings and instantly freezing the blood of every single person present. "I will not sign those papers, Julian," I declared, ensuring every single guest heard my exact words. "I will not give your fraudulent charity a single dime of my hard-earned money, and I will certainly not do it to honor a woman who actively plotted my violent murder." The immediate reaction was absolute terrifying pandemonium. For exactly 3 seconds, the room was so completely quiet, you could actually hear the ice melting in the crystal water glasses on the table. Then the entire dining room exploded into total uncontrollable chaos. Jasmine sprang up from her chair so incredibly fast it tipped over backward, crashing loudly against the decorative wall paneling. She pointed a long, trembling acrylic finger directly at my face across the table. "You selfish, lying, disgusting witch," Jasmine screamed at the absolute top of her lungs, her voice cracking with pure, unadulterated hysteria and vicious rage. "How dare you aggressively disrespect my mother in her own home? How dare you publicly humiliate my generous brother after everything he has done to elevate you from the gutter? Darnell jumped up right next to her, but he was not yelling or defending his wife. He was frantically backing away from the dining table, his face draining of all natural color, his eyes wide with absolute horror. He was quickly realizing that without my immediate signature on those specific documents, the violent Chicago loan sharks were going to execute him by Monday morning. The wealthy charity board members began whispering frantically to each other, their faces pale with profound shock and deep moral offense. Pastor Miller stood up quickly from his seat, holding his hands out in a desperate, pathetic attempt to forcefully restore order to his rapidly deteriorating flock. "Sister Chloe, please," Pastor Miller pleaded nervously, his voice trembling as he looked frantically between Julian and me. "This is a highly sacred night of spiritual healing and profound thanksgiving. The devil is clearly trying to sow terrible seeds of wicked discord in this beautiful, highly blessed home. Let us all bow our heads right now and pray for immediate reconciliation." I ignored the panicked pastor completely. I did not even turn my head to look at Jasmine as she violently continued to scream horrific, vile insults across the expensive food. My eyes remained entirely locked on my husband. The flawless, incredibly charming mask Julian had worn perfectly for our entire 4-year marriage completely shattered into a million jagged pieces right in front of my eyes. The handsome, deeply devoted Christian husband vanished entirely from his face, instantly replaced by a desperate, violent, and incredibly dangerous cornered animal. His handsome face turned a deep, terrifying shade of crimson. The thick veins in his neck and his forehead bulged violently against his dark skin, pulsing rapidly with his massively elevated heart rate. He let out a harsh, guttural sound that barely resembled a human voice. He grabbed my upper arm with both of his massive, heavy hands, his thick fingers digging so fiercely into my flesh that I knew instantly he was actively leaving deep, dark bruises on my skin. He violently yanked me upward, utilizing his massive physical advantage to forcefully drag me to stand up from my heavy wooden chair. The sudden, incredibly aggressive movement knocked my crystal water glass entirely over, sending sharp ice and cold water spilling rapidly across the white linen tablecloth and dripping loudly onto the hardwood floor below. "You are going to pick up that pen right now," Julian growled directly into my face, his voice dropping into a demonic, terrifying register that nobody in our entire church congregation had ever heard before. His hot, angry breath hit my face like a blast from a furnace. He was completely out of his mind with pure, uncontrollable, desperate rage. "You are going to sign those legal documents right this exact second, Chloe, or I swear to Almighty God, I will make you deeply regret the day you were ever born into this world," Julian threatened, violently shaking my arm so hard my teeth actually rattled. I stared directly into his wild, deeply bloodshot eyes, completely refusing to flinch, refusing to cry, and refusing to show even a single microscopic ounce of physical fear. "You cannot force me to do absolutely anything, Julian," I replied coldly, my voice slicing right through his violent, chaotic hysteria like a sharpened steel blade. "You are completely broke. You are a pathetic, desperate, lying thief, and your entire pathetic empire of lies is actively burning to the absolute ground right this very second." My sharp words hit him like a physical, devastating blow, directly to the center of his chest. He realized in that exact terrifying moment that I knew absolutely everything about his secret life. He instantly knew I had completely uncovered the massive charity embezzlement. He instantly knew his entire secure future was completely destroyed beyond any hope of repair. The absolute blinding panic mixed violently with his uncontrollable masculine rage, pushing him entirely past the point of basic human reason or social preservation. He forcefully released his right hand from my bruised arm, taking a sudden, aggressive step backward to rapidly create physical space between us. He raised his massive right hand high into the humid air of the dining room, his thick fingers curling tightly into a heavy, devastating fist. He was completely preparing to strike me directly in the face, actively planning to use his full physical strength to violently assault his own pregnant wife in front of 40 highly respected community members, prominent church elders, and his own terrified family. He was going to brutally beat me into absolute terrified submission, right there in my own dining room, completely abandoning every single remaining shred of his deeply fabricated righteous Christian persona. I did not cower. I did not raise my arms to shield my face. Instead, I grabbed his thick wrist with a sudden vicious strength he clearly did not expect. I twisted his arm sharply downward, using his own aggressive forward momentum against him, and forcefully ripped my bruised shoulder out of his violent grip. He stumbled awkwardly forward, losing his balance for a brief, humiliating second. Before he could recover his footing and lunge at me again, I took 2 rapid steps backward, putting the heavy wooden dining chair directly between us as a physical barrier. I reached into the deep pocket of my tailored dress and quickly pulled out my cell phone. Julian sneered at me, breathing heavily, entirely convinced I was trying to dial 911. He actually laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that echoed in the silent, horrified room. "You think the police are going to save you, Chloe?" He mocked violently, taking another aggressive step toward me. "You think anyone in this room is going to take your side against me?" I did not bother answering his pathetic, arrogant question. I did not open the phone dialer. Instead, my fingers moved rapidly across the glowing screen, instantly opening the smart home application that completely controlled the expensive electronics in my house. I tapped the main connection icon, instantly linking my cell phone directly to the premium Sonos surround sound system I had personally installed in the ceiling of the formal dining room and the adjoining living room. I cranked the digital volume slider all the way up to its absolute maximum limit. Then I opened my encrypted audio files, selected the master track Desmond had professionally spliced together for me, and pressed play. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for the horrific shockwave I was about to violently unleash upon the very people who had maliciously attempted to end my own precious life. The massive high-definition speakers hidden in the ceiling instantly roared to life. The audio did not start with static or hesitation. It blasted into the dining room with deafening, inescapable clarity. Darnell's panicked voice aggressively shook the crystal glasses on the banquet table. "What the hell did you actually give her?" Darnell hissed violently through the speakers. The sound was so incredibly loud and crisp that several church elders physically jumped in their seats, clutching their chests in profound shock. "Keep your damn voice down!" Julian's recorded voice snapped back, his tone laced with absolute, undeniable panic. "I gave her exactly what we discussed, just one single packet. One packet of what Darnell demanded," his voice cracking with sheer, unadulterated terror. "You told me you had this completely handled. You told me that stuff was just supposed to induce a natural miscarriage. Why the hell is your mother in anaphylactic shock?" The word miscarriage hung in the dining room air like a detonated explosive. Jasmine let out a piercing, blood-curdling scream, dropping her wine glass. It shattered violently against the hardwood floor, sending red wine splashing across her expensive heels. But she did not even notice. She whipped her head around to stare directly at her husband. Darnell's knees instantly buckled beneath him. He collapsed heavily against the dining room wall, sliding down to the floor, his face buried completely in his hands, as he violently sobbed in pure, undeniable terror. "Shut up!" Darnell Julian's recorded voice commanded desperately through the speakers. "Just shut up and follow my lead." Chloe ate the safe bowl. My mom got the wrong one because Chloe is a manipulative witch who always has to have the best portion. We just have to stick to the story. The entire dining room erupted into absolute deafening gasps of pure horror. Pastor Miller physically stumbled backward, his face turning an unhealthy shade of pale gray, utterly repulsed by the demonic confession echoing from the ceiling. Julian froze entirely. The dark color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified, hollow ghost. His raised fist slowly dropped to his side, completely useless now against the crushing weight of the absolute truth. The threatening stance he had so proudly displayed just seconds ago melted away completely. replaced by a pathetic, trembling cowardice. He opened his mouth to speak, to somehow shout over the recording, to deny the undeniable truth blasting into his own dining room, but absolutely no words came out. His vocal cords were completely paralyzed by the devastating magnitude of his sudden public exposure. He looked desperately around the room, silently begging for someone to intervene, but the crowd simply stared back at him with pure hatred. But the recording was not over yet. The audio transitioned smoothly, instantly switching from the echoing hospital stairwell to the crisp, clear interior of Valerie's luxury sedan. "Mom, I am completely out of options." Julian's voice echoed loudly, sounding incredibly stressed. "The board is going to demand a full audit by the 1st of the month. If they see the missing funds, I am going to federal prison." Darnell lost every single dime. At the head of the table, Valerie's smug, arrogant expression violently shattered. Her jaw dropped open in absolute, unmasked terror. She gripped the wooden arms of her wheelchair so tightly her knuckles turned completely white. "I told you never to trust that idiot Darnell with real money," Valerie's recorded voice snapped coldly through the speakers. "But crying about it now will not fix the deficit. What did the street contact say about the pills?" "He gave me the maximum dosage," Julian answered on the recording. "He said it is highly unrefined, extremely potent. It is guaranteed to terminate the pregnancy, but he warned me it could easily cause a massive fatal hemorrhage." "Good," Valerie's recorded voice replied, her tone dripping with absolute venom and malice. "Do not let that girl tie you down forever with a child. Listen to me very carefully, Julian. You cannot let her ghetto blood pollute our family line. Once she is permanently out of the picture, you collect that massive life insurance payout. You quietly fix your little accounting error at the charity. You pay off those violent thugs hunting Darnell. And then after an appropriate period of public mourning, you can finally marry Pastor Miller's daughter." When Pastor Miller heard his own daughter's name explicitly tied to this horrific bloody murder plot, he let out a loud, agonized groan of pure devastation. He fell heavily into his chair, burying his face in his hands, finally realizing exactly why his beloved daughter had suddenly fled the city. The entire church congregation was in a state of complete, uncontrollable pandemonium. Charity board members were aggressively pulling out their cell phones, frantically dialing their corporate lawyers to distance themselves from Julian's fraudulent organization immediately. Jasmine completely lost her mind. She lunged violently at Darnell, striking his chest with her fists, screaming hysterically about how he had destroyed their lives and bankrupted their family. Then she turned her furious attention directly to her brother. "You tried to murder my unborn niece or nephew," Jasmine shrieked at Julian, her voice shredded with raw, uncontrollable agony. "You poisoned our own mother to cover up your disgusting financial crimes. You are an absolute monster." Julian did not look at his sister. He did not look at the disgusted faces of the church elders surrounding him. He stared entirely at me, his eyes wide, vacant, and completely defeated. I stood perfectly still, my head held high, watching his manipulative world violently burn to absolute ash right before my very eyes. Valerie knew her reign of terror was officially over. She knew she could never show her face in this community again. In a final pathetic attempt to manipulate the horrific situation and garner immediate sympathy, Valerie suddenly gasped loudly. She threw her right hand dramatically over her chest, clutching the fabric of her silk gown. "Oh, my heart!" Valerie wailed loudly, her voice trembling with completely fabricated agony. She slumped heavily to the side, deliberately throwing her fragile body completely out of the wheelchair. She hit the hardwood floor with a loud, dramatic thud, lying completely still, waiting for the frantic rush of concerned church members to aggressively lift her up and coddle her. But absolutely nobody moved. Not a single person stepped forward to offer her assistance. The men and women who had praised her just moments ago simply stared down at her trembling body with absolute, unadulterated disgust. They recognized the venomous snake hiding beneath her expensive silk dress. I walked slowly around the chaotic dining table, stepping carefully over the spilled wine and broken glass until I stood directly over Valerie. She opened one eye, realizing her theatrical performance was failing miserably, and glared up at me with pure, undiluted hatred. I smiled down at her, a genuinely radiant smile of total, uncompromising victory. "You should have checked the recipe, Valerie," I whispered coldly, making sure she could hear my final judgment. Before Valerie could even attempt to formulate a pathetic, gasping response to my absolute condemnation, the heavy atmosphere in the dining room was violently shattered by a piercing mechanical wail. The sheer volume of the sirens completely drowned out the frantic, panicked whispers of the church congregation. Brilliant, blinding flashes of red and blue emergency lights suddenly tore through the sheer fabric of my expensive custom window treatments, violently illuminating the dark mahogany walls of the formal dining room. The synchronized, rhythmic flashing painted the terrified faces of Julian and his entire treacherous family in harsh, unforgiving neon colors. A heavy, booming voice, amplified by a high-powered police megaphone, echoed aggressively from the front lawn, demanding immediate compliance and absolute surrender. Jasmine shrieked again, throwing her arms over her head and diving underneath the ruined banquet table to hide from the blinding lights. Darnell simply stayed frozen on the floor, his entire body shaking violently as a dark, expanding wet stain quickly formed on the front of his tailored dress pants. He had completely lost control of his bodily functions in sheer, unadulterated terror. Julian slowly turned his head away from me, his bloodshot eyes locking onto the heavy front doors, with the hollow, dead expression of a man who suddenly realized he was stepping directly into his own meticulously dug grave. He took one frantic, stumbling step toward the kitchen, completely fueled by the pathetic coward instinct to run away through the back patio. But he was entirely out of time. The heavy reinforced oak front doors did not just open, they were violently kicked completely off their solid brass hinges by a massive steel battering ram. Over a dozen heavily armed federal agents and local Atlanta police officers aggressively swarmed into the grand foyer, their heavy tactical boots thundering loudly against the polished hardwood floors. They poured into the formal dining room like a massive, unstoppable wave of dark blue and black tactical gear. Federal Bureau of Investigation. A towering lead agent roared at the top of his lungs, sweeping the completely terrified room with absolute authority. "Nobody move a single muscle. Keep your hands completely visible." Two massive tactical officers immediately charged directly at Julian. They tackled my arrogant husband violently to the floor, driving his chest forcefully into the spilled wine and broken glass. Julian let out a pathetic, breathless grunt as a heavy tactical boot was planted firmly right between his shoulder blades, pinning him completely to the ground. "You are under federal arrest for attempted murder, criminal conspiracy, and severe federal financial fraud," the lead agent recited loudly, aggressively, yanking Julian's thick arms behind his back and snapping cold, heavy steel handcuffs onto his wrists. Across the room, three other officers violently dragged a sobbing, completely hysterical Darnell out from against the wall, throwing him face down right next to his disgraced brother-in-law. Jasmine crawled out from under the table, screaming frantically for the officers to stop, but a stern female agent forcefully shoved her back against the wall, ordering her to stay entirely quiet or face immediate obstruction charges. The charity board members and the church elders stood completely frozen against the dining room walls, their hands raised high in the air, watching in absolute horrified silence as their beloved community pillars were brutally reduced to weeping, handcuffed criminals. Julian twisted his neck painfully against the wet floorboards, looking up at me with tears streaming rapidly down his bruised face. "Chloe, please," he begged pitifully, his voice cracking with a pathetic desperation. "You have to help me. I am your husband." I did not even blink. I simply stepped over his trembling legs, walking slowly toward Valerie, who was still laying perfectly still on the floor, completely forgotten by the very congregation she had desperately tried to manipulate. I reached into my designer purse and pulled out a crisp single sheet of legal paper. I crouched down right next to her ear. "I know you can hear me perfectly, Valerie," I said, my voice completely devoid of any human mercy. I bought this entire house directly from the bank 3 months ago when Darnell missed his first massive cryptocurrency payment. You are currently trespassing on my private property. I dropped the formal, legally binding 24-hour eviction notice directly onto her trembling chest. You and your horrible daughter have exactly until tomorrow night to pack your cheap bags and get out of my home. If I find either of you still standing on my lawn by sunset, I will have you violently dragged out by the local sheriff for criminal trespassing. Valerie squeezed her eyes tightly shut, completely unable to bear the devastating reality of her absolute permanent ruin. I stood up, smoothing the expensive fabric of my navy blue tailored dress, and completely turned my back on the pathetic wreckage of the Davis family. I walked calmly past the heavily armed federal agents, past the stunned, silent church elders, and stepped gracefully out through the shattered front doors. The humid, warm Atlanta night air immediately wrapped around me, feeling completely fresh and incredibly liberating. I walked out onto the expansive front porch, the red and blue emergency lights reflecting brightly in my eyes. I gently placed my hand directly over my lower stomach, feeling a deep, profound surge of fierce, protective, motherly love wash entirely over my soul. We were completely safe now. The toxic rot had been completely excised from our bright future, moving forward forever. I looked directly ahead, feeling the incredible weight of the past 4 years, finally completely lifting off my shoulders for good. They thought my silence was weakness. Ladies, never let a toxic family use loyalty to dig your grave. Loyalty is absolutely not a blind submission to pure abuse, and standing completely up for your own life is never a betrayal of your true self. Tell me in the comments how you cut off toxic relatives and hit subscribe for more.